My husband brought his secretary to his company gala and told me not to overreact. So I brought my male assistant, let him fix my diamond necklace in front of everyone, and said the exact same thing. Do not overreact. He is just my assistant. Elliot Ashford froze so hard I almost heard his jaw crack. Before I tell you how I dismantled his entire corporate illusion in a single week, let me know where you are watching from in the comments, and hit subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant man exactly who holds the power. The annual Apex Property Solutions Gala was supposed to celebrate Elliot being named a senior director. He had spent the last 3 weeks boasting about his networking skills, practicing his handshakes, and reminding me how crucial this night was for his legacy. We walked into the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons in downtown Atlanta, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and executives sipping overpriced champagne. I wore a black velvet gown that fit perfectly, but Elliot barely looked at me when we left the house. He was too busy adjusting his tie and talking about his upcoming bonus. Within 10 minutes of arriving, my husband abandoned me near the hallway leading to the restrooms. He claimed he needed to go mingle with the vice presidents to secure his promotion. He did not go alone. I stood by a marble pillar holding a glass of sparkling water. I watched Elliot guide his 26-year-old secretary Vanessa through the crowd. She wore a bright red dress that clung tightly to her frame, laughing loudly at every mediocre joke the executives made. Elliot kept his hand firmly on the small of her back, introducing her to the partners, while completely ignoring the fact that his wife of 5 years was standing alone in the shadows. I was supposed to be the supportive wife. In the mind of Elliot, I was just a freelance consultant who scraped together pennies giving financial advice to small local businesses. He loved telling his friends that he was the primary provider, the king of the castle who took care of his struggling wife. He thrived on the idea that I needed him to survive. It gave him a false sense of superiority that he clearly needed to mask his own deep insecurities. Watching him parade his secretary around was not just disrespectful, it was a public declaration that he thought I was too weak to do anything about it. I decided I had given him enough time to play his little games. I set my glass down on the tray of a passing waiter and walked deliberately toward the center of the room. Elliot was in the middle of talking to the chief financial officer of his company when he saw me approaching. His fake polished smile immediately dropped. He excused himself from the executive and pulled Vanessa away, intercepting me before I could reach the group. "What are you doing, Valerie?" he hissed under his breath, grabbing my elbow and pulling me toward a quiet corner. "I am networking," he continued before I could speak. "You are supposed to stay by the tables. You do not understand how high-level corporate networking operates. Do not come over here and embarrass me." I looked at his hand on my arm, then shifted my gaze to Vanessa. She stood right beside him, smirking behind her champagne flute. She leaned in close, deliberately tilting her glass so a few drops of red wine splashed onto the floor, barely missing my shoes. "Oh, I am so sorry, Mrs. Ashford," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You should really be careful where you stand. It would be a shame to ruin that dress." Elliot had to put it on his company credit card, right? "You freelance consultants probably do not get to wear designer clothes very often. You should be grateful Elliot even brought you out of the suburbs tonight." Elliot did not correct her. He did not defend his wife. Instead, he rolled his eyes and let out a heavy sigh. "Do not overreact, Valerie," he said smoothly. "She is just my secretary. She helps me communicate with the board. Just go grab a plate from the buffet and wait for me to finish my rounds. Do not make a scene." A normal wife might have cried. A normal wife might have thrown a drink in his face or caused a screaming match that would have given him exactly what he wanted. He wanted me to look like the angry, bitter black woman who could not handle herself in high society. He wanted me to look small. He wanted me to shrink myself so his mediocre ego could feel massive. But I did not feel small. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, calculated clarity. I had spent years building an empire from the ground up, analyzing market trends, and dismantling hostile corporate takeovers. A cheating husband and his arrogant secretary were nothing but a minor inconvenience. What Elliot and his little secretary did not know was that I was not a struggling freelancer. For the past 6 years, I had been operating as the anonymous founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex, a private equity firm that managed hundreds of millions of dollars. I bought and sold companies 10 times the size of the one Elliot worked for. I kept my identity hidden to avoid the exact kind of gold-digging behavior I was currently witnessing. But tonight the disguise was coming off. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice. I simply smiled, reached up and tapped the face of my smartwatch twice. It was a signal to the person waiting outside. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. The subtle shift in the room energy was immediate. Executives stopped talking, heads turned. The string quartet playing in the background suddenly seemed to fade away. Walking through the doors was Julian. I was 30 years old, 6'3", and wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the annual bonus Elliot received. Julian radiated a kind of extreme wealth and sharp professionalism that commanded absolute silence. Every detail about him, from his expensive leather shoes to the precise cut of his jacket, screamed power and influence. He was my senior executive assistant, and he knew exactly how to make an entrance. Julian ignored the vice presidents attempting to make eye contact with him. He walked straight past the chief financial officer, moving with predatory grace, until he stopped right in front of me. He completely ignored Elliot and Vanessa, treating them as if they were invisible. "Good evening, Valerie," Julian said, his voice deep and smooth. He stepped intimately close to me, invading the personal space Elliot had just abandoned. "Excuse me," Julian continued, reaching out with perfectly manicured hands. "The clasp on your necklace is slightly misaligned. Allow me." Julian gently brushed my shoulders, his fingers grazing my collarbone as he adjusted the $200,000 diamond piece resting against my neck. It was a flawless, dominating display of intimacy and power right in the middle of the ballroom. The executives nearby were openly staring now, whispering among themselves about the breathtaking man attending to me. The face of Elliot went from pale to a deep, furious red. His fragile ego shattered instantly as he watched another man touch his wife while outshining him in every possible way. He stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Elliot demanded, his voice shaking with poorly contained rage. "Get your hands off my wife. Who invited you here?" Julian finished adjusting the diamonds, gave me a respectful nod, and stepped back. I looked at Elliot. I looked at his cheap suit, his panicked eyes, and his stunned secretary standing uselessly by his side. I took a slow, deliberate breath. "Do not overreact, Elliot," I said, letting the words roll off my tongue with icy perfection. "He is just my assistant." The silence that followed my words was thick enough to choke on. Elliot stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked from me to Julian and back again, unable to comprehend the massive shift in power that had just occurred. For our entire marriage, Elliot had thrived on the belief that he was my absolute savior. He loved painting himself as the successful executive husband who rescued a struggling Black woman from a life of financial instability. It was a false narrative he carefully curated for his wealthy white colleagues at the property solutions firm to make himself appear generous and commanding. But standing next to Julian, that entire illusion crumbled into dust. Julian did not just look like wealth, he smelled like it. The subtle scent of his bespoke cologne wafted through the tense air, a sharp contrast to the aggressive and cheap aftershave Elliot had practically bathed in before we left our house. The chief financial officer and the other senior partners, who Elliot had been so desperately trying to impress, were no longer discussing market trends or commercial real estate portfolios. They were watching us with rapt attention, completely captivated by the drama unfolding in their prestigious ballroom. They saw their mid-level director being utterly outclassed by a woman he had spent all evening treating like a burden. Elliot tried to puff out his chest, trying to regain some semblance of the dominant alpha male. He pretended to be, but his cheap rented tuxedo betrayed his lack of true status. The synthetic fabric bunched awkwardly at his shoulders, while the suit Julian wore fell with liquid perfection over his broad frame. Seeing the man she was sleeping with being publicly humiliated was apparently too much for the fragile ego of Vanessa to handle. She lacked the basic emotional intelligence to read the room and realized she was severely outmatched. She stepped forward again, placing her hand possessively on the arm of my husband. She looked at me with a sneer, trying to regain the upper hand by attacking the only thing she thought she understood, which was money and class status. She told me I had a lot of nerve bringing a hired helper to a high society corporate event just to make myself look important. She laughed a high-pitched grating sound and said it was pathetic that a grown woman had to pay a man to pay attention to her. She looked me up and down and said she bet Elliot was furious because he was the one footing the credit card bill for my little stunt. She told the executive standing nearby that I was just a freelance consultant who barely made enough money to cover my own weekly groceries. She said she knew for a fact that Elliot had to let me use his corporate credit card just so I could buy the black velvet dress I was wearing. She tilted her head and told me I should be on my knees thanking him instead of trying to embarrass him in front of the important people who paid his salary. I did not interrupt her arrogant monologue. I simply let her dig her own grave deeper and deeper in front of the senior partners. I looked at Vanessa and took a long moment to truly analyze the woman my husband was risking his entire future and marriage for. She was young and desperate to climb the corporate ladder by any means necessary, including sleeping with her married boss. She was wearing a bright red dress that was meant to look expensive, but the cheap polyester blend and the uneven stitching at the hem gave it away immediately to anyone with real money. Her shoes were a popular designer brand, but they were from 3 seasons ago and clearly bought on clearance. She truly thought she was swimming in the deep end of the ocean, but she was just splashing around in a shallow puddle. I took another slow sip of my sparkling water, feeling the cool liquid coat my throat before I finally spoke. I kept my voice perfectly modulated, ensuring that every single executive in our immediate vicinity could hear every word I said. I told Vanessa that she really should learn to recognize true quality before she tried to insult another woman about her clothing. I explained to her calmly that the black velvet dress I was wearing was not bought with a corporate credit card. It was a custom gown from Oscar de la Renta that required 3 private fittings and cost more than her entire annual salary at the firm. I watched the confident smirk slide right off her face as the prestigious brand name registered in her simple mind. But I was not finished dismantling her. I turned my attention back to Elliot, who was sweating profusely under the bright chandelier lights. I told him it was highly amusing that his secretary thought he had the financial capacity to fund my lifestyle. I informed the quiet group of men that the corporate credit card Elliot was so proud of holding actually had a strict monthly limit of $5,000. I let that specific number hang in the air, watching the chief financial officer raise a silent eyebrow in confirmation, since he was the one who approved those corporate limits. I looked directly into the panicked eyes of my husband and said $5,000 was barely enough to cover the cheap roadside motel room on 4th Street that he and Vanessa had rented for 3 hours last Tuesday afternoon. The collective gasp from the surrounding executives was audible. I told Elliot that he really needed to be more careful with his corporate expenses, because using company funds to pay for cheap hotel rooms to carry out an office affair was a direct violation of his employment contract. I told him I knew exactly how much he spent on the room on the cheap wine they drank and on the room service they ordered because I had kept all the receipts. I smiled warmly and added that I had already forwarded copies of those receipts to the Human Resources Department just to make sure his expense reports were properly audited before his big promotion meeting. Elliot looked like he was going to pass out right there on the marble floor. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray, and he stumbled back a step, bumping into the elaborate dessert table behind him. The senior partners he had been kissing up to all night physically took a step away from him, distancing themselves from the walking public relations disaster he had just become. Vanessa covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with absolute terror as she realized her job and her reputation were completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. Desperation makes weak men do incredibly foolish things. Instead of apologizing or remaining silent to save whatever shred of dignity he had left, Elliot pulled his phone out of his pocket with trembling hands. He tried to puff himself up, pointing a shaking finger at my face. He told me I was a crazy, vindictive woman who was making up lies because I was jealous of his success and his youth. He yelled that he was going to call the bank right now and cancel my allowance. He told me he was freezing the supplementary credit card he gave me and that I would be locked out of our house. He said he was going to teach me a harsh lesson about respect and that I would be crawling back to him begging for money to buy groceries by tomorrow morning. I looked at the man I had married 5 years ago and felt absolutely nothing but pity for his delusion. I turned to Julian, who had been standing perfectly still beside me, radiating silent intimidation and unbothered grace. I told Julian it was time for us to leave because the air in the ballroom had suddenly become incredibly cheap and suffocating. Julian offered me his arm with a graceful bow of his head. I placed my hand on his tailored sleeve and we turned our backs on Elliot. As we walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, I did not look back. I knew Elliot was frantically dialing the bank on his phone, believing he still held the power to control my life. He had no idea that the credit card he was trying to freeze was tied to an account I owned entirely, and that by morning he would wake up to find his own financial existence completely eradicated. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our upscale suburban kitchen, casting long shadows across the imported marble countertops. I sat at the kitchen island wearing a pure silk robe that draped over my shoulders like liquid silver, holding a cup of freshly brewed espresso. The house was completely silent except for the frantic and aggressive sounds of my husband pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. Elliot had been awake since dawn, fueled by an explosive cocktail of bruised ego and toxic masculinity. His face was still flushed with the lingering humiliation from the gala the night before, and he was furiously shoving files into his leather briefcase with unnecessary force. He kept muttering under his breath, pacing like a caged animal, trying to convince himself that he was still the king of a castle that was rapidly crumbling beneath his feet. Elliot slammed his briefcase shut and finally turned his venomous glare toward me. He crossed his arms over his chest, trying to look imposing, but the dark circles under his eyes only made him look pathetic. He told me I had made the biggest mistake of my miserable life by trying to humiliate him in front of the senior partners at the St. Regis. He said I was nothing but a low-level freelance consultant who played with spreadsheets while he was out doing real business that actually mattered in the corporate world. He laughed a harsh and bitter sound, telling me he had already called the bank the moment he woke up. He proudly announced that he had frozen my supplementary credit card and canceled my monthly allowance. He leaned against the kitchen counter smirking as he told me he could not wait to see how long my pathetic little freelance gig would sustain me without his generous financial support keeping a roof over my head. I did not flinch or offer him the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I took another slow sip of my espresso, letting the rich flavor wash over my tongue. It was almost comical how profoundly he misunderstood our financial reality. For 5 years, he truly believed he was the primary breadwinner because I allowed him to pay the basic household utility bills while I secretly funneled millions of dollars through offshore accounts and private equity portfolios. I watched him adjust his tie, the exact same cheap tie he wore last night, and simply nodded. I told him that freezing a supplementary card was a very bold move for a man who did not even know the password to his own primary banking application. Before Elliot could spit out another insult, his cell phone began to vibrate violently on the granite countertop. He snatched it up, expecting it to be a groveling apology from his boss, or perhaps a comforting text from Vanessa. Instead, his face contorted in confusion as he answered the call. I listened quietly as the manager of the luxury coffee shop down the street apologetically informed him over the phone speaker that his morning mobile order could not be processed. The manager explained that the corporate black card Elliot had kept on file had been declined due to insufficient funds. Elliot snapped at the manager, telling him their system was obviously broken because he was a senior director who made well over $250,000 a year. He tried to input a secondary card into his digital wallet, but the application rejected that one as well. The frustration radiating off him was palpable as he realized his morning routine was entirely disrupted. He was a creature of habit who relied on these small daily luxuries to validate his sense of importance, and having that stripped away by a simple decline transaction was a direct blow to his fragile ego. He hung up the phone in a huff, muttering about incompetent service workers and glitchy software. Elliot aggressively tapped the screen of his phone, opening his mobile banking application to prove a point to himself. I watched carefully as his arrogant smirk slowly melted off his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. His thumb swiped across the screen again and again, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. The checking account that usually held his sizable corporate bonuses and his monthly salary now displayed a bold red zero. He frantically switched to his savings account, only to find the exact same terrifying number staring back at him. His hands began to shake so badly that he nearly dropped the device onto the tile floor. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and wild like a cornered animal. He demanded to know what kind of illegal stunt I had pulled. He yelled that there had to be a bank error because his money was gone, all of it wiped out in the middle of the night. I set my espresso cup down on the matching saucer with a soft, deliberate clink. I folded my hands on the island and looked him dead in the eye. I reminded him of a conversation we had 5 years ago right after we got married. I reminded him how he complained about the tedious paperwork required to merge our finances and how he had happily tossed the documents my way, telling me to handle the boring administrative tasks so he could focus on his very important career. I kept my voice perfectly flat, stripping away any trace of the obedient wife he thought he knew. I explained to him that because I was the one who actually filed the paperwork and structured the accounts, I had listed myself as the primary account holder. He was nothing more than an authorized user on an account that I completely controlled. I told him that while he was busy calling the bank this morning to freeze a meaningless supplementary card, I had already spent the entire night legally executing a full transfer of all available liquid assets into a private offshore trust that he could never touch. I elaborated on the financial structure, revealing that the joint account he believed was his primary wealth generator was actually tethered to a corporate holding company I had registered years ago. I told him that every bonus he deposited, every paycheck he proudly brought home, had been feeding into a system designed to protect my assets from the very beginning. His money was no longer his money, it was legally absorbed into a larger corporate portfolio that he had willingly signed over his rights to on the day we purchased the house. I made it very clear that I had not stolen anything, but had simply relocated funds from an account that belonged to me, taking back every single cent of equity I had poured into our life together while he was out renting cheap motel rooms with his secretary. Elliot gripped the edge of the kitchen island, his knuckles turning white as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He had no cash, no credit, and no way to pay for even a cup of coffee. He bared his teeth, snarling that I was a psychotic thief who belonged in prison. He swore he was going to hire the most vicious divorce attorney in Atlanta to tear me apart. He promised to take the house, the cars, and demand permanent alimony because he knew I was hiding money from him. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed toward the front door, shouting over his shoulder that I had made an enemy out of the wrong man and that he would destroy me before the week was over. The heavy front door slammed shut behind him, rattling the picture frames in the hallway. I remained seated at the kitchen island, completely unbothered by his theatrical exit. His threats were empty words from an empty man. He was driving off to a job he was about to lose in a car he could no longer afford to put gas in. I pulled my own encrypted phone from the pocket of my silk robe and sent a brief message to Julian, instructing him to proceed with the next phase of the asset liquidation. I knew Elliot would immediately call his family, crying about how his evil wife was trying to ruin his life. His sister Tasha and her arrogant white husband Spencer were predictably going to rush over here to defend their precious golden boy. They had always hated me, and this was exactly the excuse they needed to try and put me in my place. I poured myself another shot of espresso, welcoming the quiet calm before the inevitable storm. They were going to walk right into a trap they could not even comprehend. The evening shadows began to stretch across the pristine marble floors of my custom kitchen, blurring the lingering traces of the chaotic morning. I sat in the exact same spot where I had systematically dismantled Spencer and Tasha just hours earlier, enjoying a fresh glass of imported mineral water. The house was completely quiet, but it was that heavy, loaded silence that always precedes a devastating storm. Exactly at 7 o'clock, the tranquility was permanently shattered. The heavy custom mahogany front door did not just open, it was violently kicked inward. The sound of the solid brass handle slamming against the expensive drywall echoed through the grand foyer like a gunshot. Elliot marched into the house, moving with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a man whose entire universe was rapidly spinning out of his fragile control. His breathing was heavy and ragged, and his usually perfect corporate hair was deeply disheveled. Right behind him, clinging to his arm like a cheap accessory purchased from a discount rack, was Vanessa. She was wearing a tight black dress that looked completely out of place in my sophisticated home, looking around with wide, greedy eyes, as if she were touring a luxury real estate property she was about to purchase. She stepped onto my imported Persian rugs with her stilettos, making no effort to hide her intense jealousy and mounting entitlement. Elliot stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed with a dark, volatile anger that made the veins in his forehead bulge against his skin. He slammed his leather briefcase onto the floor, not caring that the metal clasps deeply scratched the imported hardwood. He leaned his entire body over the kitchen island, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. He yelled that Spencer had called him sobbing in the middle of the corporate parking lot outside their office building. He told me Spencer had been completely financially ruined and that his sister Tasha was currently threatening to file for an immediate divorce because their prestigious country club membership was publicly revoked and their massive private debts were suddenly sent to aggressive collection agencies. The most pathetic part of his aggressive screaming tirade was the absolute sheer delusion he still desperately clung to. Elliot yelled that he knew exactly what I was doing and that he had figured out my little psychological game. He claimed that I must have manipulated the banking applications this morning by hacking his passwords and that my interference with the golf club was just a lucky coincidence. He told me I must have slept with some mid-level regional manager at Vanguard Apex to get them to buy that specific golf club debt just to harass his successful family. The sheer idea that I, the quiet black woman he had married, could actually be the chief executive officer pulling the massive financial strings was so far beyond his limited mental capacity that his brain simply refused to process the actual reality of the situation. He told me that sleeping with corporate executives to settle petty domestic disputes was the lowest, most pathetic thing a woman could possibly do to her hard-working husband. I did not even bother correcting his wildly inaccurate and highly insulting assumptions. Letting him truly believe I was just a desperate, angry wife using temporary illicit connections gave him a false sense of security that would make his eventual absolute destruction so much sweeter. Vanessa walked around the massive kitchen island, running her manicured fingers over my expensive imported stainless steel appliances. She picked up a crystal vase from the counter and examined it with a sneer. She told me it was a very beautiful kitchen for someone who clearly did not know how to cook a proper meal for a real successful man. She told me I should go upstairs and pack my bags quietly, because Elliot had finally realized he needed a woman who truly understood his corporate ambitions and knew exactly how to treat a rising executive with the respect he truly deserved. She leaned her body against my husband, wrapping her arms possessively around his waist, and kissing his cheek right in front of me to assert her newly claimed territory. Elliot puffed out his chest, attempting to look like a dominant, fearless provider who was firmly in control of his romantic and financial destiny, despite having $0 in his bank account just hours prior. Elliot reached inside his wrinkled suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents printed on premium bonded paper. He threw the thick stack violently onto the marble kitchen island. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the stone surface punctuated the aggressive, suffocating tension filling the room. He announced with immense pride that those were highly aggressive divorce papers, prepared by the most ruthless corporate litigation lawyer he could find in the entire city of Atlanta. He told me his lawyer had advised him to take absolute immediate control of the narrative before I could try any more of my pathetic little freelance stunts to ruin his pristine reputation at the property tech firm. He began to list his ridiculous legal demands with a smug, deeply satisfied grin spreading across his exhausted face. He stated clearly and loudly that he was taking full permanent possession of the $2 million house we were currently standing in. He said he was also legally taking both of the luxury vehicles parked in the garage because he needed them to maintain his high-level executive image while entertaining crucial corporate clients. Furthermore, he leaned in extremely close, resting his palms on the marble, and whispered that he was formally demanding permanent spousal support. He said he knew I had to be hiding a significant amount of money in order to orchestrate the cancellation of his bank accounts earlier that morning, and his forensic accountants were going to tear through my freelance business. He loudly declared he was legally entitled to half of whatever secret savings I had scraped together during the 5 years of our marriage. Elliot pulled Vanessa closer to his side, wrapping his arm possessively around her waist, while she beamed with arrogant pride. He looked me dead in the eyes, his gaze filled with pure, unadulterated contempt and a sickening sense of victory. He told me that he was officially upgrading his life right here and right now. He said he was entirely tired of carrying the dead weight of an ungrateful, unaccomplished woman who deliberately went out of her way to embarrass him in front of his wealthy white colleagues at important industry galas. He told me Vanessa was the future of his happiness, a woman who actually appreciated his hard work, his genius, and understood her proper place beside a titan of industry. He said they were going to live in this massive house, host incredible lavish parties for his new senior partners, and completely erase any lingering memory that I had ever stepped foot inside these walls. He detailed how his elite legal team would completely freeze my tiny freelance business accounts, how they would aggressively subpoena every single client I had ever worked for, and how they would drag my professional name through the absolute mud until no one in the city of Atlanta would ever hire me for a consulting gig again. He said the forensic accountants were already preparing to tear through my private life, and that signing the house over to him right now was the only possible way I could avoid federal prison for whatever illegal hacking stunt I pulled on his personal bank accounts that morning. He told me the $2 million house was his rightful compensation for putting up with my miserable attitude for 5 years. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a sleek silver pen. Clicking it open with a sharp sound, he slammed the pen down directly on top of the massive stack of divorce papers, pushing them toward me across the smooth island surface. His voice dropped to a low, highly threatening growl as he delivered his final arrogant ultimatum. He told me I had exactly 5 minutes to pick up that pen and sign the quitclaim deed, giving him absolute sole ownership of the entire property without a fight. He threatened that if I refused to sign the house over to him right this very second, his ruthless lawyers would completely bury me in an endless nightmare of aggressive civil litigation. He promised to tie me up in court for decades, launching a brutal discovery process that would drain whatever tiny freelance consulting funds I had left until I was homeless, penniless, and crawling back to my old working-class neighborhood, begging for absolute scraps. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, standing tall, and told me to pick up the pen and surrender because the game was officially over and he had already won everything. The cool night air washed over me the second I stepped out of the heavy mahogany front door, leaving the suffocating arrogance of my soon-to-be ex-husband behind me. The sound of his gloating and the high-pitched laugh of Vanessa were immediately muffled as the solid wood clicked shut, sealing them inside a domestic prison of their own making. I pulled my single sleek suitcase down the paved walkway, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone path. I did not look back at the $2 million property. There was absolutely no reason to mourn the loss of an empty box of debt. Parked silently at the curb, blending perfectly into the evening shadows, was a midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom. The engine hummed with a low vibration of pure power. Standing at perfect attention, beside the rear passenger door was Julian. He wore a flawless tailored charcoal suit, his expression completely neutral, but his eyes shone with a quiet, knowing loyalty. He reached out and took my single suitcase, sliding it effortlessly into the trunk before opening the heavy rear door for me. I slid into the plush leather interior, enveloped instantly in the quiet sanctuary of extreme wealth. Julian closed the door softly and took his place behind the steering wheel. We pulled away from the suburban neighborhood, gliding smoothly over the asphalt. The sprawling houses of the so-called elite faded into the rearview mirror as we headed toward the glowing skyline of the city. The interior of the car was a sensory deprivation chamber, muting the noise of the outside world. I leaned my head against the soft headrest, letting the absolute perfection of my execution wash over me. Julian navigated the city streets with precision, his hands steady on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. It went exactly as projected. Madam, Julian said, his voice smooth and professional, breaking the quiet atmosphere of the cabin. I smoothed the fabric of my dress over my knees. Men who believe they are inherently superior always follow the most predictable patterns of behavior, Julian. He threw the quitclaim deed on the counter and demanded I sign it. He truly believed he was stripping me of my last remaining asset to fund his new life with his cheap mistress. Julian allowed a faint smile to touch the corners of his mouth. He reached into the passenger seat beside him and retrieved a thick black leather dossier, handing it back to me over the center console. I took the heavy file, resting it on my lap. The embossed logo of my private equity firm caught the ambient light from the street lamps passing by outside the tinted windows. We arrived at the private underground parking facility of my actual primary residence. The heavy steel gates slid open, granting us access to the deepest, highly secured level of the building. Julian parked the Phantom in its designated spot right next to my private collection of imported sports cars that Elliot never even knew existed. Julian escorted me to the private secure elevator. It required biometric access. I placed my hand on the scanner and the doors slid open silently. We stepped inside and the elevator began its rapid, smooth ascent to the absolute top of the city. The doors parted to reveal the $15 million penthouse that served as my true home. The space was a breathtaking expanse of modern architecture. Floor-to-ceiling glass wrapped around the entire perimeter, offering an uninterrupted panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta skyline. The floors were constructed of polished dark hardwood, imported from Brazil, contrasting beautifully with the minimalist custom furniture and the massive abstract paintings adorning the pristine white walls. A custom linear fireplace flickered with a warm, silent flame, adding a touch of heat to the massive open-concept living area. This was the physical manifestation of the empire I had built in complete secrecy, while playing the role of a quiet, supportive wife in that miserable suburban house. I walked over to the massive, absolute black marble dining table and set the leather dossier down. Julian followed, carrying a silver tray with a crystal decanter of aged bourbon and two heavy glass tumblers. He poured a small measure of the amber liquid into one glass and set it silently at my right hand. "The trap has fully snapped shut," Julian said, taking a step back and clasping his hands behind his back. The financial execution was entirely seamless from start to finish. I opened the dossier and flipped to the first page, reviewing the crisp legal documents filled with dense financial jargon. "Walk me through the final timeline, Julian. I want to hear the precise mechanics of his absolute destruction." Julian nodded, his tone shifting into the sharp, rapid delivery of a top-tier financial advisor. "Exactly 6 months ago, when we first acquired undeniable photographic evidence that Elliot was engaging in an illicit relationship with his secretary, Vanessa, you instructed my team to initiate the Phantom Trap Protocol. We knew Elliot valued social status and physical property above all other assets. We also knew he paid absolutely zero attention to legal paperwork when he believed he was in a position of complete authority." I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the complex flavors burn pleasantly down my throat. I turned the page of the dossier, staring at the original mortgage documents. He always called himself the man of the house. He loved the title but hated the actual responsibility of reading the fine print. "Precisely," Madam Julian continued. "Leveraging your position as the primary financial controller of the household, you secretly restructured the financing of the $2 million property. You executed a highly aggressive balloon mortgage against the estate. By utilizing your actual corporate credentials quietly in the background, you were able to cash out 100% of the total equity that had been built up over the 5 years of your marriage. The cash was immediately liquidated and transferred directly into your untraceable offshore trust accounts, operating out of the Cayman Islands, leaving the house as nothing more than a hollow shell of massive debt." I traced my finger over the signature line where Elliot had scrawled his name blindly. He thought he was signing routine tax documents that morning. He was drinking his coffee, complaining about his workload, and he simply signed exactly where I placed the sticky notes. He never bothered to read the header. He never bothered to look at the terms, because his ego would not allow him to believe a freelance consultant could outmaneuver a rising corporate executive. Julian replied smoothly. By signing those documents, Elliot legally bound himself as the primary guarantor of the newly restructured massive debt. The terms of the balloon mortgage were designed with extreme prejudice. It offered an artificially low introductory rate for exactly 6 months to ensure no red flags appeared on his basic credit monitoring apps. However, the core stipulation of the contract mandated that the absolute entire principal balance would become immediately due in full the very moment the deed changed hands or sole ownership was declared. I closed the dossier, placing both of my hands flat on the cool marble surface of the table. The sheer mathematical beauty of the trap was deeply satisfying. So when he forced me to sign that quitclaim deed this evening, demanding that I surrender all of my legal rights to the property, he triggered the acceleration clause. Yes, Julian confirmed, stepping forward to point at the final highlighted paragraph in the file. By forcing you to sign over your half of the deed, Elliot successfully claimed total absolute ownership of the house just as he wanted. But in doing so, he legally assumed total absolute responsibility for the entire balloon mortgage. He successfully legally claimed a $2 million debt that must be paid in full within 30 days. I looked out the massive glass windows at the city below, watching the tiny lights of the cars moving along the distant highways. Elliot had stripped his own bank accounts trying to hide his money from me earlier that morning, completely unaware that those accounts were already empty. He had isolated his sister and his brother-in-law by exposing them to immense financial ruin. He had brought his cheap mistress into a house he thought he had stolen from me. He demanded the house, I said softly, my voice echoing slightly in the vast luxury of the penthouse. He demanded every single brick. He threatened to tie me up in litigation for decades if I did not surrender the property to him. He was so desperate to upgrade his life that he eagerly signed his own financial death warrant, Julian stated. The bank will issue the formal demand for the $2 million balloon payment first thing tomorrow morning. Since his liquid assets are currently negative and his credit has been completely frozen due to the offshore transfers, he will default immediately. The bank will initiate aggressive foreclosure proceedings before the end of the business week. Vanessa will barely have time to redecorate the master bedroom before the eviction notice is nailed to the front door. I picked up my glass and finished the remaining bourbon. The warmth spread through my chest, a physical mirror of the cold victory settling into my bones. Elliot believed he was an apex predator, discarding a weak, useless wife to claim his rightful place at the top of the corporate food chain. He believed his aggressive tactics and his ruthless lawyers would leave me penniless and begging on the streets. He had demanded that I sign over the house or face total destruction. He took the bait flawlessly, Julian, I said, turning away from the window to face my loyal confidant. He wanted to be the sole king of his little suburban castle. Now he can sit on a throne made entirely of inescapable suffocating debt. Prepare the legal team for the next phase. Tomorrow we completely dismantle his career at the property tech firm. Understood, madam, Julian replied, bowing his head respectfully. He gathered the bourbon decanter and the glasses, returning them to the silver tray. He paused before walking toward the kitchen area, his professional demeanor slipping just a fraction to reveal his profound respect. It is truly a privilege to watch you work. The penthouse fell perfectly silent as Julian walked away. I stood alone in the center of the massive room, surrounded by the authentic, undeniable empire I had built with my own hands. There were no loud arguments here. There were no arrogant men demanding apologies or projecting their own miserable insecurities onto my life. There was only the quiet, absolute certainty of a woman who had meticulously orchestrated the perfect financial slaughter. The phantom trap had executed flawlessly, and my ex-husband was currently sleeping peacefully in a massive, expensive cage, totally, completely, and irreversibly ruined. Exactly 48 hours had passed since Elliot triumphantly kicked me out of my own home. The morning sun filtered through the expensive custom sheer drapes of the living room, casting a warm golden glow over the imported mahogany furniture and the pristine white marble floors. Elliot was lounging on the massive Italian leather sofa, feeling like the absolute king of a conquered castle. He wore a silk robe loosely tied around his waist, sipping a freshly brewed espresso from one of my fine porcelain cups. He genuinely believed he had executed the perfect corporate and domestic takeover. He looked around the sprawling $2 million estate, admiring the vaulted ceilings and the expensive contemporary artwork on the walls, completely convinced that all of this immense wealth now belonged to him free and clear. Sitting on the plush velvet accent chair across from him was Vanessa. She had completely moved her cheap belongings into the master suite the very same night I left. She was currently wearing a designer cashmere sweater that she had shamelessly pulled directly from my closet, running her manicured fingers over the screen of her latest smartphone. She was scrolling through luxury furniture catalogs, loudly complaining about my basic taste in decor, and listing all the wildly expensive renovations she planned to make using the money she assumed Elliot was hiding. The heavy, suffocating silence of their shared delusion was suddenly broken by the sharp sound of the brass door knocker echoing through the grand foyer. Elliot sighed loudly, visibly annoyed that his peaceful morning of gloating was being interrupted. He slowly stood up from the leather sofa, stretching his arms and casually walking toward the massive front door. He fully expected to find a delivery driver dropping off a congratulatory gift from one of his junior executives, or perhaps a courier delivering the finalized divorce paperwork from his ruthless legal team. He swung the heavy mahogany door open with an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. Standing on the slate porch was a grim-faced courier holding a thick certified document envelope bearing the official embossed seal of a major national bank. The courier did not smile. He simply handed Elliot an electronic pad and demanded a signature for a certified priority delivery. Elliot pulled his expensive silver pen from his pocket and signed the screen with a dramatic flourish, still completely trapped in his delusion of absolute power. He took the heavy envelope and closed the door, walking back toward the massive kitchen island. Vanessa did not even look up from her phone screen as she casually asked if the package contained the new diamond tennis bracelet she had demanded the night before. Elliot ignored her shallow question and slid his thumb under the flap of the thick envelope, tearing it open. He pulled out a crisp stack of densely printed legal documents. He leaned against the cold marble countertop and began to read the first page. The arrogant smirk that had lived on his face for the last 2 days slowly began to slide off, replaced by a sickening pale gray color that drained all the life from his skin. The document in his shaking hands was a formal, accelerated demand for immediate payment. His eyes darted frantically across the heavy financial jargon, trying to process the absolute nightmare written in black and white. The paperwork clearly outlined the exact terms of the massive balloon mortgage he had blindly assumed the moment he forced me to sign the quitclaim deed to the house. The numbers jumped off the page like physical blows to his chest. The bank was formally demanding the immediate and total payment of $2 million. The document clearly stated that the entire massive principal balance was due in exactly 30 days. Elliot felt a cold, paralyzing sweat break out across his forehead. His breathing became shallow and rapid as he frantically flipped to the second and third pages, desperately looking for a mistake or a clerical error. But there were no mistakes. The forensic financial breakdown attached to the demand letter laid out his absolute ruin with terrifying clarity. The document brutally noted that the current equity of the massive estate sat at exactly $0 since every single cent had been aggressively cashed out and transferred to offshore trust accounts. It further detailed that his personal liquid savings were completely non-existent. The bank had already run a fresh sweep of his credit profile and determined that all of his available credit limits were completely maxed out or frozen due to sudden suspicious offshore activity. The walls of the pristine custom kitchen suddenly felt like they were rapidly closing in on him. The air in the room grew thin and suffocating. The absolute crushing reality of his financial slaughter was staring him right in the face, mocking his fragile ego and his pathetic corporate pride. He was not the king of a castle. He was the sole legal guarantor of a hollow shell of inescapable debt, and the countdown clock had already started ticking. Vanessa sighed loudly, completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial meltdown happening just 3 feet away from her. She tapped her long fingernails against the screen of her phone and whined in a high-pitched, demanding voice. She told Elliot that she urgently needed his black credit card because she had just found the perfect $5,000 imported Italian chandelier to replace the basic light fixture in the dining room. She complained that she could not possibly host the senior partners for a celebration dinner next week if the house still looked like it belonged to a boring freelance consultant. The sheer volume of her shallow, greedy demands triggered something dark and volatile inside the fragile mind of Elliot. The sudden explosive rage boiled up from his stomach and erupted without warning. He let out a guttural scream of pure fury and slammed his clenched fist down onto the marble kitchen island with such massive, terrifying force that it made the expensive crystal vases rattle and shake. He screamed at the top of his lungs, telling her to shut her pathetic mouth about chandeliers and designer handbags. He yelled with bulging veins in his neck that they were standing in a rotting house of debt and that he had absolutely $0 to his name. He screamed that they were totally, completely, and utterly ruined and that she was a stupid, greedy child for not seeing it. Vanessa shrank back into the velvet chair, her eyes wide with sheer terror, as the man she thought was her wealthy ticket to high society completely unraveled before her eyes. The echo of his furious screaming slowly faded into the vast empty spaces of the house. Elliot stood panting heavily, staring at the terrified face of his cheap mistress. The sight of her fear slowly snapped him out of his blind panic. His massive, deeply ingrained corporate ego simply refused to accept that a quiet black woman who worked from home had completely outsmarted and destroyed him. He closed his eyes and took several deep, ragged breaths, forcing his racing heart to slow down to a manageable rhythm. He ran his shaking hands through his disheveled hair and straightened the collar of his silk robe, desperately trying to slip back into his arrogant, untouchable corporate persona. He pointed a shaking finger at Vanessa and told her in a low, cold voice to go upstairs and stay completely silent until he figured this out. Vanessa did not argue. She scrambled out of the chair and practically ran up the curved hardwood staircase, leaving him alone in the suffocating silence of the kitchen. Elliot grabbed his mobile phone from the counter and aggressively tapped the screen to dial his brother-in-law. The phone rang 3 times before Spencer finally answered the line. Spencer sounded completely exhausted, broken and terrified, likely hiding in some cheap motel room after Tasha threw him out for ruining their social standing. Elliot did not ask how Spencer was doing. He immediately began pacing the entire length of the kitchen island, clutching the phone to his ear with a white-knuckled grip. He told Spencer to shut up and listen very carefully because they had a guaranteed foolproof way out of this temporary cash flow problem. He spoke with a frantic, forced confidence, trying to convince himself just as much as he was trying to convince the broken man on the other end of the line. Through rapid, sharp dialogue, Elliot reminded Spencer about the massive, high-stakes corporate presentation scheduled for tomorrow morning at the property tech firm. He reminded Spencer that their entire department had spent the last 3 months preparing to pitch for a massive $50 million capital injection that would completely revolutionize their company. Elliot paced faster, his bare feet slapping against the cold marble tiles as he outlined his desperate, highly delusional plan. He told Spencer that the investors they were pitching to were a highly secretive, incredibly powerful, and famously aggressive private equity firm known in the industry only as Vanguard Apex. Elliot firmly believed that Vanguard Apex was a faceless giant made up of old, rich white men who would eagerly pour millions of dollars into their property tech firm. Elliot gripped the edge of the marble counter, leaning his weight forward as he spoke frantically into the receiver. He vowed to Spencer that they just needed to nail this one single pitch tomorrow morning. He wildly promised that the massive executive bonus he would receive for personally securing the $50 million Vanguard Apex deal would easily cover the $2 million balloon payment for the house, with plenty of cash left over to rebuild their frozen bank accounts. He told Spencer that securing this deal would immediately fast-track both of them to senior partner status, making them completely untouchable within the city of Atlanta. Elliot laughed, a sharp, manic sound of pure delusion echoing through the empty kitchen. He told Spencer that Valerie was just a lucky amateur who stumbled into a temporary advantage, but tomorrow they were going to play in the big leagues and take back everything that was rightfully theirs. He hung up the phone, feeling a renewed surge of arrogant power, completely and utterly unaware that Vanguard Apex, the mysterious giant private equity firm he was banking his entire survival on was actually entirely owned and controlled by the very woman he had just thrown out of his house. He was actively preparing to walk into a boardroom tomorrow morning to blindly beg for his financial life directly from the hand of the apex predator he thought he had defeated. The morning sun pierced through the towering 50-story glass facade of the Vanguard Apex headquarters, casting sharp geometric shadows across the pristine imported Italian marble floors. The lobby was a vast cathedral of modern corporate power, designed specifically to intimidate anyone who walked through its massive revolving doors. There was no chaotic chatter here, only the hushed, respectful silence of multi-billion-dollar transactions moving invisibly through the air. Security personnel in tailored black suits stood like statues at every access point, monitoring the flow of the city's elite. The atmosphere was thick with the kind of untouchable wealth that did not need to shout to be recognized. Through those heavy glass doors walked Elliot, moving with the desperate, exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he was about to conquer the world. He adjusted the lapels of his gray suit, a suit that looked incredibly cheap and poorly fitted against the backdrop of this elite financial fortress. He was vibrating with a frantic, nervous energy, completely blind to the fact that a $2 million balloon payment was silently ticking down like an explosive strapped to his chest. Walking right beside him was Spencer, clutching a thick leather portfolio tightly to his chest. Spencer was sweating profusely from the pressure of the upcoming $50 million pitch, looking around the massive lobby with wide, terrified eyes, recognizing that he was entirely out of his depth. Flanking Elliot on his other side was Vanessa. The sight of her walking into a top-tier private equity firm was genuinely comical. Elliot had officially promoted her to project director of his department just hours before the pitch, a meaningless, hollow title meant entirely to stroke her fragile ego and cement her new status as his corporate partner. She had dressed for the occasion in a way that defied all professional logic. She wore a skin-tight, bright crimson dress that stopped several inches above her knees, paired with massive gold hoop earrings and platform stilettos that clicked loudly and inappropriately against the polished stone floor. She strutted across the lobby, acting as if she were walking a red carpet at a cheap nightclub, rather than entering the most ruthless financial institution in the state of Georgia. She looked down at the actual corporate employees passing by, her face locked in a permanent sneer of unearned superiority, utterly delusional about her place in this environment. Elliot approached the main reception desk, which was carved from a single massive block of black granite. He puffed out his chest and announced his presence with an arrogant, demanding tone, stating that he and his executive team were here for the crucial property tech pitch and expected to be escorted to the executive boardroom immediately. The receptionist, a woman who dealt with actual billionaires and global CEOs on a daily basis, simply blinked at his loud, unprofessional behavior. She politely instructed him to take a seat in the general waiting area until his party was called. Elliot sighed loudly, rolling his eyes to make sure everyone around him knew he felt deeply inconvenienced by having to wait with the regular people. He turned around to survey the vast lobby, putting his hands on his hips and projecting an aura of completely fake dominance. His gaze swept over the indoor water features and the abstract metal sculptures before stopping abruptly at the raised glass-enclosed VIP waiting area, situated slightly above the main floor. That was exactly where I was sitting. I was resting comfortably on a custom tufted leather sofa, perfectly framed by the morning light. Julian stood silently at attention, just a few feet away, projecting an aura of absolute elite security and unspoken menace. I was dressed for a financial slaughter. I wore a breathtaking bespoke $10,000 power suit cut from the finest midnight blue wool silk blend available in the world. The tailoring was dangerously precise, wrapping around me like a piece of modern armor. The jacket featured subtle, angular shoulders that projected pure authority, while the trousers fell perfectly over my imported leather pumps. A single vintage Cartier watch rested on my wrist, catching the light and signaling a level of generational wealth that Elliot could not even begin to fathom. I looked like exactly what I was, the apex predator of this entire building. I raised a delicate porcelain cup to my lips, taking a slow, calming sip of imported white peony tea. I watched Elliot stare at me. I could literally see the gears in his limited mind grinding to a halt. and then violently snapping back into his preferred comfortable delusion. His ego simply refused to process the visual reality of my power. His brain immediately decided that my $10,000 bespoke suit must be a cheap imitation purchased from a discount rack, and that my presence in the exclusive VIP area was some sort of pathetic administrative mistake. His face flushed with a dark, ugly mix of anger and triumphant glee. He grabbed Vanessa by the arm and pointed a shaking, furious finger in my direction. He aggressively marched across the lobby floor, completely ignoring the polite requests of the receptionist to remain in the designated general waiting zone. Spencer hurried after them, looking nervously at the security guards but too cowardly to stop Elliot from making a massive, humiliating scene. Elliot breached the threshold of the VIP area, his cheap shoes scuffing against the plush imported rug. Julian instantly took a step forward, his posture shifting into a highly dangerous protective stance, ready to physically remove the threat. But I simply raised a single manicured finger to stop him. I wanted Elliot to speak. I wanted to let him dig his grave as deep as he possibly could before I buried him in it. Elliot stopped right in front of my low-glass coffee table, leaning his entire body forward in an aggressive, looming posture. He let out a loud, barking laugh that echoed terribly against the glass walls, drawing the annoyed and curious stares of several high-level executives passing through the lobby. His voice was dripping with absolute venom and unchecked arrogance as he looked down at me. "Did you come here to beg for a receptionist job? Or are you here to beg me to pay your rent? You can't be in this building. This is for billionaires, not freelancers." Vanessa stepped up right beside him, wrapping her arms tightly around his bicep and laughing her high-pitched, grating laugh. She looked me up and down with intense, visible disgust, totally oblivious to the fact that her own outfit was a complete corporate embarrassment. She told me I was acting like a desperate, crazy stalker tracking them down at their place of business. She confidently announced that the building security was probably going to throw me out onto the street, the exact second they realized a poor, struggling consultant had sneaked into the private VIP section just to beg her successful ex-husband for a handout. She leaned her head against Elliot, looking at me with pure venom, and told me my basic suit was wrinkling the expensive leather sofa. Spencer stood behind them, wiping cold sweat from his forehead, chuckling nervously and adding his own pathetic insults. He said I was completely out of my mind for trying to ruin their massive career-defining day, and that I needed to accept that Elliot had moved on to bigger and better things. He tightly gripped his presentation folders, looking around the room and muttering that I was going to cost them their $50 million deal if I kept harassing them in public. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Elliot. I gently placed my porcelain teacup back onto its matching saucer with a soft, deliberate click. The absolute silence I offered them was heavy and suffocating, a sharp, devastating contrast to their loud, chaotic panic. I simply sat there draped in $10,000 of undeniable power, breathing in the quiet luxury of my own building. I let them scream their desperate insults into the void, completely unaware that they were currently mocking and insulting the very woman who owned the company they were about to beg for money. They stood there laughing in my face, utterly blind to the fact that I held the absolute power of life and death over their $50 million pitch, their fragile careers, and their entire miserable futures. Spencer was sweating so profusely that large, dark, damp patches were rapidly blooming under the arms of his poorly fitted suit jacket, making him look entirely unprofessional and completely out of place in the pristine environment of the Vanguard Apex headquarters. He clutched his thick presentation folders tightly against his chest, like a physical shield, desperately scanning the vast geometric expanse of the multi-billion-dollar lobby for someone to rescue him from the imaginary threat I supposedly posed. His terrified eyes darted frantically toward the heavy black granite reception desk, and then snapped toward the bank of private elevators where the elite corporate security team was stationed. He raised his trembling hand and began waving it wildly in the air, snapping his fingers with a loud, disrespectful crack, like a poorly trained dog trying to get the attention of the highly disciplined guards. He yelled out across the quiet, sophisticated space, his voice cracking with pure panic and a completely unearned sense of authority. He demanded that building security come over to the raised VIP section immediately. He pointed a shaking, sweating finger directly at me and shouted that I needed to be forcibly removed from the premises, right this very second before I ruined everything. He loudly announced to the guards and anyone else in the lobby who was forced to listen to his chaotic outburst that I was his brother-in-law's crazy ex-wife and that I was illegally trespassing in a class A commercial building where a poor broke freelancer clearly did not belong. The sheer volume and aggressive pitch of his voice shattered the hushed, respectful silence of the corporate fortress. Several high-level executives and senior partners in bespoke tailored suits paused their hushed confidential conversations to turn and stare at the sweating, frantic man, making an absolute total fool of himself in the center of their sanctuary. Vanessa quickly joined in on the humiliating public spectacle, stepping forward in her ridiculous bright crimson skin-tight dress and her clunky platform stilettos. She waved her manicured hands aggressively at the approaching security personnel, her cheap layered jewelry clanking loudly and inappropriately in the quiet, refined space. She shrilly added her own demands, telling the guards that I was a desperate, deranged stalker who had been following them all morning just to beg for a financial handout and deliberately ruin their massive corporate pitch. She loudly complained to the approaching officers that it was an absolute catastrophic security failure, that a broke, miserable freelancer had even been allowed to sit on the imported tufted leather furniture in the exclusive waiting area. Elliot stood right between his sweating brother-in-law and his cheap mistress, puffing out his chest and crossing his arms tightly over his torso with a look of supreme, arrogant satisfaction. He was thoroughly enjoying the chaotic public spectacle, completely convinced that the universe was finally about to deliver the brutal, devastating humiliation he felt I so deeply deserved. He looked down at me with a sickening, victorious smirk spreading across his exhausted face, telling me that I should have just taken his warning the other night and stayed hidden in whatever miserable little suburban apartment I had managed to crawl into. The heavy measured footfalls of the elite security detail echoed sharply against the polished Italian marble floors as they moved to respond to the disturbance. The head of security, a massive, burly, no-nonsense man with a thick neck, broad, muscular shoulders, and a closely shaved head, led the rapid approach. He was a truly intimidating figure, dressed in a flawless, dark-tailored suit, with a coiled acoustic earpiece resting neatly behind his ear, and a subtle lapel pin indicating his senior rank. His expression was carved from solid stone, completely devoid of any emotion, hesitation, or concern as he moved across the lobby with the swift, terrifying efficiency of a highly trained professional. Three other heavily built security officers flanked him in a tight tactical formation, creating a dark, intimidating moving wall as they closed the distance between the main lobby floor and the raised glass-enclosed VIP section where we were gathered. Elliot watched the imposing wall of muscle approach, and his arrogant smirk somehow managed to grow even wider, stretching across his face in pure, triumphant glee. He uncrossed his arms and casually slipped one hand into his pants pocket, acting exactly like a wealthy, powerful executive who had just successfully ordered the swift physical removal of a minor, annoying pest. He leaned his body down toward me, the smell of his heavy, cheap cologne mixing with the sour scent of stale coffee on his breath. He whispered maliciously that I was finally about to experience what real corporate power looked like. He told me that these men did not care about my pathetic little freelance feelings or my fake expensive-looking suit, and that they were going to physically grab me by my arms and drag me kicking and screaming out onto the cold concrete sidewalk where all the important people could watch me cry. Spencer nodded enthusiastically at his brother-in-laws, cruel words wiping the fresh beads of sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He thanked the security guards loudly and repeatedly as they marched up the short flight of stairs to our section, telling them they were doing a truly great job and that they needed to act fast to remove the trash before I could somehow compromise the massive $50 million deal they were about to pitch to the senior partners upstairs. Vanessa let out a high-pitched, grating giggle, covering her mouth with her hand and taking a deliberate, exaggerated step backward. She pretended to be physically afraid of me, acting as though she needed to clear a wide path for the burly men to safely grab my arms and drag me away. She told Elliot in a loud stage whisper that she sincerely hoped the guards would toss me directly into the busy street traffic because my cheap, desperate presence was deeply upsetting her morning vibe and ruining her mood before her big fake project director debut. I did not move a single muscle in response to their chaotic taunts. I did not flinch or look away or show even the slightest microscopic fraction of fear or intimidation. I simply sat there, relaxed on the custom leather sofa, bathed in the warm morning light, wearing my flawless $10,000 bespoke suit, and taking another slow, calming sip of my imported white peony tea. Julian remained standing, perfectly still, just a few feet behind my right shoulder, his hands clasped casually behind his back, watching the unfolding disaster with the completely neutral expression of a loyal man who already knew the devastating punchline to a very dark and painful joke. The burly head of security breached the threshold of the VIP area, his heavy polished shoes making absolutely no sound as he stepped onto the plush imported area rug. Elliot immediately stepped aside, making a sweeping theatrical gesture with his arm, like an arrogant valet directing the guards straight toward my sitting form. He confidently instructed the large man to handle the trash quickly and make absolutely sure that I never stepped foot inside this prestigious building ever again. The head of security did not even look at Elliot. He did not acknowledge Spencer or his frantic sweating or Vanessa and her inappropriate crimson dress. The massive guard completely ignored their entire loud, chaotic existence and walked right past Elliot, moving through his physical space as if the arrogant property tech executive was nothing more than a completely invisible ghost. Elliot was left standing there, frozen with his arm extended, pointing at empty air as the head of security entirely bypassed him. The large, burly man marched directly toward my low-glass coffee table and stopped precisely 2 feet in front of me, coming to a perfect, disciplined halt. The terrifying, intimidating aura that he had aggressively projected while crossing the lobby floor vanished instantly, replaced entirely by a posture of absolute total deference and unwavering loyalty. He planted his feet together and bent at the waist, executing a deep, highly respectful formal bow that signaled absolute submission to my authority. The three heavily built security officers standing right behind him immediately mirrored the movement, bowing deeply and silently in perfect synchronized unison. The hushed, busy lobby seemed to hold its collective breath, watching the most powerful and ruthless security force in the city suddenly humble themselves before the quiet black woman sitting casually on the sofa. The head of security slowly straightened his posture, keeping his large hands respectfully clasped in front of him, and his eyes slightly lowered so as not to challenge my gaze. His rough, deep voice carried clearly and steadily through the sudden, suffocating, absolute silence of the room. "Good morning, Madam Chairman," he said with unwavering, profound respect. "Is this group harassing you?" The simple, professional words dropped into the quiet space like heavy lead stones, rippling outward and violently shattering the very fabric of the false reality Elliot had so carefully built for himself. The burly man did not ask for my identification or demand to know why a freelancer was sitting there. He did not ask me to explain my presence to the screaming people around me. He simply addressed me by my rightful title, acknowledging me publicly as absolute supreme authority of the 50-story financial fortress we were currently standing in. He shifted his broad shoulders just a fraction, subtly angling his large, intimidating frame toward Elliot and Spencer, silently waiting for my single command to physically obliterate them from the building. I slowly lowered my delicate porcelain teacup back onto its matching saucer, the soft click of the ceramic sounding incredibly loud and final in the frozen room. I looked up at the head of security and gave him a very small, slow nod of acknowledgement, silently appreciating his prompt and flawless execution of duty. The sheer, absolute shock that violently struck Elliot Spencer and Vanessa was not just a brief, emotional surprise. It was a devastating physical reaction that completely paralyzed their bodies. They froze instantly, locking into place like statues carved from cheap, brittle stone. The smug, arrogant smirk that had been permanently plastered across Elliot's face just seconds earlier was instantly and violently wiped away as if struck by a physical blow. The deep, flushed red color of his triumphant anger rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray hue that made him look completely hollow. His eyes bulged out of his head, staring wildly at the bowing security guards in pure, unadulterated horror. His limited, fragile brain simply could not process the impossible, terrifying data it was receiving. The quiet woman he had proudly thrown out of his house, the useless wife he had blindly handed a $2 million balloon mortgage, the broken person he had just publicly degraded as a desperate freelancer was currently being addressed as the chairman of the mysterious giant private equity firm he was about to beg for his financial life. Spencer physically swayed on his feet, his knees buckling slightly under the crushing, catastrophic weight of his sudden, absolute realization. The thick presentation folders he had been clutching to his chest suddenly slipped from his sweaty, trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a loud, messy slap. The carefully prepared financial documents and the desperate corporate pitch materials spilled out across the beautiful imported rug, completely ignored. Spencer looked back and forth between me and the massive head of security, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a suffocating fish, trying to pull oxygen from the thin, dry air. He realized in that exact agonizing second that the massive, highly secretive entity known as Vanguard Apex was not a faceless group of old, rich white men, but rather it was me, and he knew instantly that their entire careers, their finances, and their miserable lives were officially and permanently over. Vanessa took a shaky, terrified step backward, her platform stilettos wobbling dangerously under her weight. She shrank behind Elliot, her wide, greedy eyes suddenly filled with the cold, paralyzing terror of a small, weak animal that had just realized it was trapped in a cage with an apex predator. She grabbed Elliot's sleeve, pulling at the cheap fabric of his suit, as if trying to wake him up from a terrible nightmare. But Elliot could not wake up, because the nightmare was entirely real, and it was sitting right in front of him. The heavy, suffocating realization of the phantom trap. The ruined bank accounts, the revoked country club membership, and now this absolute corporate slaughter finally crashed down onto his hollow ego, crushing it into dust. He trembled violently, his entire body shaking as he forced his mouth to form words. "Madam," he stammered, his voice nothing more than a broken, pathetic whisper echoing in the quiet lobby. "Madam." "What?" Elliot stood frozen with his mouth hanging open. The words "Madam what?" dying on his lips as the suffocating reality of the lobby crashed down on him. The 4 massive security guards remained bowed at my feet, an undeniable physical testament to my absolute authority. Before Elliot could even attempt to force his fragile brain to process the catastrophic revelation, a soft melodic chime echoed through the silent geometric expanse of the lobby. The heavy brushed steel doors of the private VIP elevator located just a few feet behind my custom leather sofa slid silently open, revealing a pristine interior of dark mahogany and smoked glass. Julian stepped out of the cab, his polished shoes making no sound against the imported marble floor. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his posture perfectly rigid, and he held a sleek black iPad casually in his left hand. He walked down the short flight of stairs, moving with the lethal grace of a highly trained predator, and stopped right next to the low-glass coffee table. He looked directly at Elliot's pale, trembling face and allowed a slow, cold smile to stretch across his lips. It was a smile devoid of any warmth, a smile that promised absolute corporate slaughter. "Mr. Ashford," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet space. "I see you have met the CEO and founder of Vanguard Apex." The words hit Elliot like a physical blow to the chest, violently knocking the remaining breath from his lungs. His knees visibly buckled, his cheap gray suit suddenly looking even more pathetic against the backdrop of my multi-billion-dollar empire. Spencer let out a pathetic whimpering sound, dropping his hands to his sides and staring blindly at the spilled presentation folders scattered across the imported rug. Vanessa shrank back until her spine hit the glass partition, her bright crimson dress looking like a ridiculous clown costume in the center of a financial fortress. Their entire universe had just violently inverted. The freelance consultant. They had spent years mocking the quiet wife they thought was financially dependent. The woman they had just thrown out into the night with a massive balloon mortgage was the apex predator of their industry. I did not speak a single word. There was absolutely no need to waste my breath on dead men. I simply stood up from the custom tufted leather sofa, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a monarch claiming her throne. I reached down and smoothly adjusted the crisp cuffs of my $10,000 bespoke power suit, feeling the cool metal of my vintage Cartier watch brush against my skin. I kept my eyes locked onto Elliot's terrified face for one long, agonizing second, letting him see the sheer, absolute emptiness in my gaze. There was no anger. There was no sorrow. There was only the cold, mechanical certainty of his impending destruction. I broke eye contact and walked forward, my imported leather pumps clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I moved right past the three of them, the air displacing around me as I glided through their physical space like they were completely irrelevant ghosts. I stepped into the spacious interior of the private VIP elevator, turning around to face the lobby as Julian seamlessly took control of the situation. Julian looked down at Elliot and Spencer, his cold smile fading into a mask of pure professional disdain. "Madam Chairman is ready for your $50 million pitch now," Julian stated, his tone slicing through the quiet lobby like a scalpel. "Do try not to sweat on her boardroom table." The burly head of security immediately snapped to attention, his massive frame pivoting toward the three trembling figures. He did not ask them to move. He simply took a menacing step forward, gesturing forcefully toward the open elevator doors with a thick, muscular arm. The other three guards mirrored his movement, creating an inescapable wall of dark suits that physically herded Elliot, Spencer, and Vanessa forward. They stumbled blindly toward the elevator like cattle being led to the slaughterhouse. Spencer bent down in a blind panic, desperately trying to scoop up the scattered financial documents with shaking, sweaty hands, cramming the wrinkled papers against his chest before scrambling up the short stairs. Vanessa wobbled dangerously on her clunky platform stilettos, her manicured hands gripping Elliot's arm so tightly her knuckles were turning a sickly shade of white. Elliot walked like a man marching to his own execution, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes wide and unblinking. They crossed the threshold of the elevator, shuffling awkwardly to the far back corner of the massive cab to put as much distance between us as physically possible. Julian stepped in, last standing firmly near the control panel and scanning his biometric credential to initiate the ascent. The heavy brushed steel doors slid shut with a soft, definitive click, sealing us inside a soundproof chamber of pure escalating tension. The elevator began its rapid, smooth acceleration, rocketing upward toward the 50th floor. The absolute silence inside the cab was deafening. I stood near the front, staring straight ahead at my own faint reflection in the polished metal doors, projecting an aura of complete, untouchable dominance. Behind me, the sound of their panic was entirely physical. Spencer was openly hyperventilating, his breath hitching in his throat as he desperately tried to smooth out the crumpled edges of his $50 million presentation. He knew their pitch was supposed to save their careers and secure their status as senior partners, but he was now completely painfully aware that the person evaluating that pitch was the very woman he had just publicly demanded be dragged out of the building by security. His cheap suit was drenched in cold sweat, the sour smell of raw fear radiating off him in invisible waves. He kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, making tiny squeaking noises against the mahogany floorboards, terrified to look up, terrified to look down, terrified to even exist in my presence. Vanessa was pressed so hard against the back wall of the elevator that she looked like she was trying to physically merge with the expensive paneling. Her high-pitched, grating confidence was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing dread. She kept taking rapid, shallow breaths, her chest heaving under the tight crimson fabric as her greedy little mind tried and failed to comprehend the impossible scope of my wealth. She had shamelessly bragged about taking my house and redecorating my master bedroom, completely blind to the fact that I literally owned skyscrapers. She was trapped in a small metal box, with a woman whose daily passive income likely dwarfed her entire lifetime earning potential. She squeezed her eyes shut tightly, refusing to look at the back of my perfectly tailored suit, praying that this was all just an incredibly vivid nightmare from which she would suddenly wake up. But it was Elliot who was experiencing the most profound and devastating internal collapse. I could hear the erratic shuffling of his cheap shoes as his entire body trembled uncontrollably. His corporate ego, his massive, fragile pride, the absolute foundation of his entire identity, was disintegrating into fine dust in real time. Every cruel joke he had ever made about my freelance work, every arrogant demand he had ever barked at me in our kitchen, every single time he had puffed out his chest and called himself the man of the house echoed back to him now as a catastrophic, humiliating joke. He was a pathetic, mid-level property tech executive who was blindly begging for a massive capital injection from a giant private equity firm, and he had just realized his quiet, submissive wife owned the entire bank. The $2 million balloon mortgage waiting for him at the empty suburban house suddenly felt like loose pocket change compared to the absolute financial execution he was about to face in my boardroom. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had swallowed him whole. Elliot stared at the back of my perfectly styled hair, his mind violently connecting the dots he had been too stupid to see for years. The frequent business trips I took, the complex tax documents, I always managed the quiet authority I carried, that he had always mistaken for obedience. He realized with sickening clarity that the $50 million pitch this morning was never a lucky break for his firm. It was a meticulously orchestrated ambush. He had been invited to Vanguard Apex specifically, so I could watch him beg for his professional life. His breathing grew even more ragged as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. I had not just set a trap with the house, I had built an entire labyrinth of ruin around his career, his finances, and his reputation. He was an insect that had willingly crawled into the center of a very large, very expensive web. The elevator climbed higher and higher, pulling them further away from the ground and deeper into my absolute domain. The digital floor indicator above the doors rapidly flashed upward, 40, 45, 48, each glowing red number, ticking down the final seconds of their miserable corporate existence. The pressure in the cabin was so thick it felt like plunging to the bottom of the ocean. They were completely trapped in the phantom grip of their own massive arrogance, rising swiftly toward a brutal financial bloodbath they had spent their entire lives blindly sprinting toward. The soft chime of the elevator signaled our arrival at the top floor. The doors slid open, revealing the sprawling executive suite of my empire. The slaughter was officially ready to begin. The massive frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, revealing a sprawling chamber designed for absolute corporate dominance. The room was vast and intimidating, dominated by a custom-carved mahogany table that stretched 30 feet down the center. Panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the Atlanta skyline, but the men entering the room were in no condition to admire the scenery. Elliot stumbled through the doorway, his cheap gray suit clinging to his sweat-drenched body. Spencer followed closely behind him, practically hyperventilating as he clutched his crumpled presentation folders against his chest like a useless shield. Vanessa wobbled in last, her bright crimson dress and clunky platform stilettos, looking completely absurd in the cold, unforgiving light of the multi-billion-dollar financial sanctuary. I was already waiting for them. I sat at the very head of the massive mahogany table, perfectly centered in a high-backed black leather executive chair. My $10,000 midnight blue power suit absorbed the ambient light, making me look like a solid block of untouchable authority. Julian stood silently in the corner of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the three terrified intruders with the cold, detached gaze of an executioner. The four burly security guards who had escorted them up the elevator spread out along the back wall, blocking the only exit and sealing the trap completely. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the ragged, rapid breathing coming from Spencer and the loud, inappropriate clicking of Vanessa's cheap shoes as she desperately tried to find a place to stand. Elliot moved toward the side of the table, his hands trembling so violently that he had to press them flat against the polished wood just to keep himself upright. His face was a sickly shade of pale gray, completely drained of the arrogant corporate swagger he had worn like a mask for the last 10 years. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat as he looked down the length of the table at me. His fragile mind was still desperately trying to deny the catastrophic reality of the situation, attempting to find some logical explanation for why his quiet, submissive wife was sitting in the chairman's seat of Vanguard Apex. He cleared his throat and opened his mouth, forcing a pathetic, strained smile onto his face. He started to speak, stammering out a greeting and mentioning the $50 million property tech pitch he had spent 3 months preparing. He awkwardly reached for the top button of his suit jacket, trying to project confidence as he suggested that maybe we could put our personal differences aside and focus on the lucrative business opportunity his firm was bringing to my table today. He rambled on about synergy and mutual benefits, sweating profusely under the cold, bright lights of the ceiling fixtures, completely oblivious to the fact that he was speaking to a wall of solid ice. I did not let him finish a single coherent thought. I raised one single manicured finger, and the entire room went completely dead silent. His pathetic words died instantly in his throat as his mouth snapped shut. He looked at my raised finger as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his forehead. I did not ask him to sit down. I did not offer them water. I simply lowered my hand and calmly reached for the thick, heavy red folder, resting perfectly aligned on the table in front of me. The bright red color of the folder seemed to radiate danger in the muted corporate space. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably on her feet, her eyes darting nervously between the imposing security guards and the red folder in my hands. The hollow artificial confidence she had displayed in the lobby was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, shivering fear of a woman who had just realized she was completely out of her depth and utterly defenseless. I opened the cover of the folder with a sharp, deliberate movement, folding it back and exposing a dense stack of heavily highlighted financial documents and official banking records. I did not look at Elliot. My eyes locked directly onto Vanessa, pinning her in place like an insect under a microscope. I told her that we were not going to discuss property tech or capital injections today. I told her that instead we were going to discuss the exact sum of $80,000 she had meticulously embezzled from the corporate expense accounts of her employer over the last 6 months. The word embezzled dropped into the silent boardroom like a heavy stone, shattering the fragile tension in the room. Vanessa physically recoiled, her jaw dropping open in pure horror. Elliot whipped his head around to stare at her, his eyes wide with sudden, paralyzing panic. Spencer let out a pathetic whimpering sound and took a slow, terrified step away from them, as if trying to distance himself from the blast zone before it detonated. I did not raise my voice, but the quiet, absolute certainty in my tone sliced through the air with devastating precision. I looked down at the top sheet of the audit report and began to read the forensic breakdown of her financial crimes. I detailed the specific dates and locations of the luxury hotel rooms they had booked for their miserable little afternoon affairs, perfectly matching the days Elliot had claimed he was working late on crucial client acquisitions. I read out the itemized receipts for the expensive imported champagne, the high-end room service, and the private car services, all explicitly billed back to the property tech firm's marketing budget, using fraudulent vendor codes that Vanessa had personally generated and approved under her newly gifted title. Vanessa began to shake uncontrollably. She wrapped her arms tightly around her stomach, completely unable to look at Elliot or the intimidating security guards standing by the door. I pulled out the next page of the audit, which highlighted a secondary layer of blatant corporate theft. I calmly listed the expensive designer handbags, the imported Italian shoes, and the high-end salon treatments that Vanessa had systematically charged to the company by disguising them as promotional materials and client gifts. I read the exact serial numbers of the purchases, noting that the total amount of stolen corporate funds had crossed the legal threshold from a minor civil offense into a major federal felony, carrying a massive prison sentence. Elliot stared at the marble floor, his breathing shallow and rapid. He knew that he had blindly signed off on every single one of those expense reports, completely blinded by his lust and his arrogant assumption that nobody was paying attention to the numbers. He had promoted his cheap mistress to project director just to stroke her ego, and in doing so, he had given her the unlimited financial access she needed to hang them both. His chest heaved as he realized he was legally complicit in an $80,000 corporate fraud case that had just been dragged into the open light. Vanessa tried to speak, her voice shaking and cracking as she desperately attempted to deny the charges. She stammered that it was a misunderstanding, that she had mixed up her personal and corporate cards, that she had always intended to pay the money back before the quarterly audit finalized. Her pathetic excuses echoed terribly in the vast, silent room, completely ignored by everyone present. She looked toward Elliot, begging him with her wide, terrified eyes to step in and defend her, to use his supposed executive power to fix the catastrophic disaster falling on her head, to protect the woman he had destroyed his marriage for. But Elliot said nothing. He stood completely frozen, completely paralyzed by the sheer crushing weight of his own impending destruction. He did not even look at her. He just stared at the red folder in my hands, realizing with sickening clarity that the massive $50 million pitch he had banked his entire survival on was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated slaughterhouse designed to trap them both. He had no power here, and he finally knew it in his bones. I closed the red folder and placed my hands flat on the mahogany table, leaning forward slightly to deliver the final devastating blow. I looked directly into Vanessa's panicking eyes and spoke the words that would completely eradicate her miserable existence and sever her from the corporate world forever. As the majority shareholder of your firm, as of 8 a.m. this morning, I just fired you. Furthermore, Vanguard's legal team has forwarded these receipts to the FBI for corporate fraud. Security, escort her out. The burly head of security moved instantly, stepping forward from the wall with terrifying speed. He grabbed Vanessa firmly by the upper arm, his massive hand wrapping completely around her bicep. Vanessa let out a piercing, high-pitched scream of absolute terror as the physical reality of my words took hold of her. She thrashed wildly against the guard's grip, her clunky platform stilettos slipping and scraping uselessly against the expensive polished floor. She screamed for Elliot to help her, to do something to stop them from taking her away, to save her from the nightmare unfolding around them. Two more security officers stepped forward, closing in around her and grabbing her other arm, completely lifting her off the ground. She kicked and thrashed, her bright crimson dress riding up awkwardly as she descended into total public hysterics. She sobbed uncontrollably, her makeup smearing down her face in dark, ugly streaks as she begged and pleaded for mercy, screaming that she did not want to go to federal prison for buying handbags and booking hotel rooms. Her frantic screams echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom, violently shattering the refined corporate atmosphere. The guards did not hesitate or slow down. They dragged her forcefully backward toward the heavy frosted glass doors, her feet dragging uselessly across the floor, leaving scuff marks on the expensive stone. Julian stepped forward and pressed the panel to open the doors, allowing the guards to drag the sobbing, hysterical woman out of the room and into the busy executive corridor beyond, where dozens of high-level employees were now watching the spectacle. I sat perfectly still, watching the entire chaotic scene unfold with absolutely zero emotion. I did not blink. I did not smile. I simply watched as the cheap, greedy woman who had slept in my bed and stolen my life was physically removed from my building and hauled away to face federal indictment. The heavy glass doors slid shut abruptly, cutting off the pathetic sounds of her sobbing and plunging the boardroom back into a deep, suffocating silence. Elliot and Spencer were left standing alone at the side of the massive table, completely isolated and completely terrified. They stared at the closed doors, their faces pale and slick with cold sweat, finally understanding the absolute devastating scope of the massacre they had walked into. Their breathing was the only sound left in the room, echoing loudly in the quiet space. Target 1 was successfully eliminated and removed from the board, completely destroyed, without a single drop of blood being spilled. I slowly turned my gaze back toward the men standing in front of me, leaning back into my leather chair as I prepared to address the individuals who were next in line for absolute and total destruction. The heavy frosted glass doors slid shut with a definitive mechanical click, sealing the executive boardroom once again in a suffocating, impenetrable silence. The chaotic echoes of Vanessa's desperate sobbing and the frantic scraping of her platform shoes faded into nothingness as she was dragged down the corridor toward the waiting federal authorities. Inside the sprawling room, the atmosphere had dropped to an absolute freezing temperature. I sat perfectly still at the head of the massive custom mahogany table, my $10,000 midnight blue power suit feeling like a suit of impenetrable armor. Julian remained standing in the corner, a silent, lethal shadow observing the carnage, while the four heavily built security guards resumed their positions by the exit, effectively blocking any chance of escape. Elliot and Spencer were left entirely alone, completely isolated in the center of the vast corporate slaughterhouse. Elliot was staring blankly at the empty space where his mistress had been standing just moments before his face, a sickening shade of chalky gray. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths as his fragile mind violently attempted to process the reality that his perfectly constructed life was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. But it was Spencer who broke first. The crushing, catastrophic weight of the situation finally shattered whatever pathetic remaining loyalty he held toward his brother-in-law. Spencer physically stumbled away from Elliot, his poorly fitted suit jacket soaked through with dark patches of cold, terrified sweat. He scrambled toward the edge of the boardroom table, his hands trembling so violently that the scattered financial documents he was still clutching fell to the floor in a messy pile. He did not bother to pick them up. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his clammy palms flat against the polished wood, and looked directly at me with wide, desperate, pleading eyes. The arrogant swagger he had displayed in the lobby was entirely eradicated, replaced by the raw, pathetic desperation of a man who realized he was standing on the trap door of the gallows. He opened his mouth and a rush of frantic, stammering words spilled out. He told me that none of this was his fault, that he had never wanted to disrespect me, and that Elliot had forced him into it. He pointed a shaking finger at Elliot, who was too paralyzed by shock to even defend himself against the sudden betrayal. Spencer claimed that Elliot was a tyrannical narcissist who demanded total obedience from his executive team, and that any failure to join in on the cruel jokes about me would have resulted in his immediate termination. He leaned closer, his voice cracking with panic, begging me to understand that he had always secretly respected my intellect and my strategic mind. He swore that he had always known I was the true brilliant force behind Elliot's early success, and that he had privately argued with Elliot to bring me on as a senior partner. It was a pathetic, disgusting display of pure cowardice. He was perfectly willing to throw the man he had blindly followed for a decade directly under the bus, if it meant saving his own miserable skin. I let him ramble on, his voice echoing off the panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows, his desperate apologies filling the silent room. I did not interrupt him. I simply watched him squirm, letting him expend all his frantic energy until his words collapsed into breathless, incomprehensible whimpers. When he finally ran out of breath, staring at me with the eager, pathetic hope of a stray dog expecting a scrap of mercy, I slowly leaned forward in my high-backed leather executive chair. I folded my hands neatly on the table, resting them right next to the red audit folder. I told him that his sudden, profound respect for my intellect was incredibly fascinating, considering his extensive documented history of racist microaggressions. The tiny spark of hope in Spencer's eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, paralyzing terror. He physically recoiled, taking a shaky step back from the table. I did not raise my voice, but the cold, mechanical precision of my words sliced through him like a blade. I casually reminded him of the company holiday party 3 years ago, where he had loudly assumed I was a diversity hire consultant rather than Elliot's wife and asked me to fetch him a bourbon. I recounted the countless times he had made inappropriate, uninvited comments about my natural hair, treating me like a fascinating exhibit rather than a human being. I detailed the specific strategic meetings where I had provided Elliot with the core data for their initial expansion, only for Spencer to refer to my contributions as cute little administrative suggestions while attributing the actual genius to Elliot. Spencer opened his mouth to protest, his hands waving frantically in front of him. He stammered that those were just harmless office jokes, that he had a terrible sense of humor, that he never meant any real harm by his cultural comments. He desperately tried to pivot the conversation back to his corporate values, sweating profusely under the harsh ceiling lights. He puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the ghost of his former executive authority. He loudly proclaimed that regardless of his personal flaws, he was the undisputed architect of the firm's operational success. He insisted that his specific department was the absolute backbone of the entire company, and that if I was truly the ruthless private equity chairman I claimed to be, I would recognize that firing him would destroy the firm's market share and ruin my own investment. I looked at Julian, who gave a barely perceptible nod and pressed a button on the sleek black iPad he was holding. The massive digital presentation screen covering the entire far wall of the boardroom hummed to life. The screen displayed a highly detailed forensic financial breakdown of the property tech firm. The charts were dominated by glaring aggressive lines of red ink plunging sharply downward. I gestured toward the screen calmly, instructing Spencer to turn around and look at the actual irrefutable data regarding his so-called indispensable department. Spencer slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto the massive screen. His mouth dropped open and he let out a sharp, ragged gasp. The numbers displayed were not the carefully manipulated, artificially inflated projections he and Elliot had planned to pitch to Vanguard Apex. They were the raw, brutally honest operational costs and revenue deficits of his specific division spanning the last 36 months. The forensic audit clearly highlighted a systematic, catastrophic failure in his management. His department had been bleeding massive amounts of capital, completely unable to secure new clients while hemorrhaging their existing contracts due to his sheer incompetence and lazy oversight. He stared at the towering red charts, his mind violently rejecting the visual proof of his absolute failure. He began to shake his head rapidly, muttering that the numbers were wrong, that the audit was flawed, that the overall company revenue was perfectly fine. He looked back at me, his face slick with sweat, begging me to look at the consolidated corporate sheets, claiming that his division was essential for maintaining their overall industry footprint, even if it operated at a slight temporary deficit. I did not blink. I kept my gaze locked onto his terrified, sweating face, preparing to deliver the final, absolute execution of his entire professional existence. The words I spoke were cold, final, and completely devastating. Your legacy is a myth, Spencer. Your department only survived because Vanguard secretly subsidized it to keep the company afloat until our takeover. I am officially dissolving your division today. You are fired without severance and your stock options are voided due to gross negligence. Have a nice walk to the unemployment office. The sheer absolute finality of the statement struck him with the force of a physical blow. The heavy, suffocating realization that he had not built anything of value, that his entire career was a hollow artificial illusion, funded entirely by the very woman he had spent years mocking, finally crushed him. His legs completely gave out beneath him. His knees buckled violently, and he collapsed backward, falling heavily into one of the plush leather boardroom chairs. The breath left his lungs in a hollow, pathetic wheeze as his body went completely limp. His arms dangled uselessly over the armrests, his eyes wide and vacant, staring blindly at the polished mahogany table. He was completely, permanently ruined, stripped of his title, his wealth, and his false dignity in a matter of minutes. Elliot remained standing just a few feet away, entirely frozen in place. He had just watched his mistress get dragged away to face federal prison, and now he had witnessed his senior partner and closest ally be financially incinerated without a single drop of blood being spilled. The room fell back into a deep, terrifying silence, save for the sound of Spencer's rapid, shallow breathing as he sat paralyzed in the chair. Two of the primary targets had been flawlessly eliminated, removed from the board with clinical, devastating precision. I slowly shifted my gaze away from the broken, sweating man in the chair and turned my full, undivided attention toward Elliot, preparing to dismantle the final remaining piece of the miserable life he had tried to force me into. The heavy silence of the boardroom pressed down on Elliot, like a physical weight crushing the last remaining fragments of his arrogant corporate facade into a fine, useless powder. He stood entirely alone at the long edge of the massive custom mahogany table, looking frantically from the heavy frosted glass doors, where his screaming mistress had just been violently dragged away, to the slumped, broken form of Spencer, sitting completely paralyzed in the plush leather chair nearby. The air in the vast room felt incredibly thin, making it difficult for him to pull oxygen into his lungs. He slowly turned his head back to me, his eyes wide, unblinking, and completely hollow. The catastrophic reality of his absolute destruction was finally overriding his delusional, fragile ego. His legs began to tremble uncontrollably, the cheap synthetic gray fabric of his suit vibrating as his knees simply gave out beneath him, incapable of supporting the crushing weight of his sudden profound realization. The loud sound of his knees hitting the polished imported marble floor echoed sharply in the quiet room, a pathetic, sickening thud that signaled the total unconditional surrender of a man who had spent his entire life pretending to be an untouchable titan. Elliot did not try to stand back up. His dignity was entirely gone, eradicated by the terrifying display of power he had just witnessed. Instead, he dragged himself forward on his knees, his expensive imported leather shoes scraping awkwardly and loudly behind him as he crawled like a wounded animal closer to the head of the boardroom table where I sat. Sweat was pouring down his pale face, stinging his eyes and mixing with the hot tears of pure terror that were now spilling freely over his cheeks. He looked up at me from the cold floor, his hands reaching out to grip the thick edge of the heavy wood table, as if he were dangling helplessly from the edge of a steep cliff. He opened his mouth, and a desperate, pathetic, ragged sob tore violently from his throat, echoing off the panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows. He began to beg, his voice cracking and pitching upward in a sickening display of absolute raw cowardice. He cried out that he was so incredibly sorry that he had been blind and stupid and that he never truly wanted to hurt or disrespect me. He frantically pointed a shaking, sweating finger back toward the closed glass doors, claiming that Vanessa had manipulated his mind and completely poisoned him against our sacred marriage. He swore wildly that she had practically forced him to kick me out of our home, and that she was a greedy, opportunistic parasite who meant absolutely nothing to him in the grand scheme of his life. He dragged his knees an inch closer, his knuckles turning a sickly shade of white as he gripped the polished wood, trying to pull himself up just enough to look me directly in the eyes. He stared at me with wide, pleading, desperate eyes, and said with a trembling voice that he still deeply loved me. He begged me to please remember the 5 long years we had spent together, building a life, swearing repeatedly that we could fix our broken marriage, and that this entire humiliating disaster was just a terrible temporary mistake that we could move past. His voice grew faster and more frantic as a new, highly delusional idea sparked in his panicking, terrified brain. He told me that we were a powerful, unstoppable couple and that we were destined to rule the corporate world together. He said excitedly that with my massive private equity wealth and his extensive property, tech experience, we could totally dominate the entire financial landscape as a unified husband and wife team. He pleaded with me to call off the imposing security guards, standing silently by the door, and let him stand proudly by my side as my equal partner so we could run the Vanguard Apex empire together, making billions of dollars side by side. I looked down at the weeping, sweating, broken man, kneeling on my expensive marble floor, and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical, profound disgust. I did not interrupt his frantic, pathetic groveling. I simply sat perfectly still in my high-backed executive chair and let him completely exhaust his pathetic supply of desperate lies until his voice faded into breathless, ragged gasping. Julian stood silently in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, casually observing the slaughter with the detached professional interest of a scientist watching an insect struggle in a jar. I slowly unclasped my hands from the table and reached smoothly into the pocket of my $10,000 tailored midnight blue suit. I pulled out my phone, the sleek black device catching the bright ambient light of the overhead crystal chandelier. I kept my gaze locked onto his terrified, sweating face as I tapped the glass screen deliberately, navigating to the specific audio file I had carefully saved just a few days ago. I pressed play and placed the phone flat on the center of the boardroom table, allowing the pristine, high-end acoustics of the room to perfectly amplify the sound. The crystal-clear digital recording instantly filled the dead-heavy air of the boardroom. It was Elliot's own voice booming aggressively across the marble floors and bouncing harshly off the panoramic glass windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The recording played the exact devastating moment from the night he threw me out of our house into the cold. His recorded voice was dripping with absolute cruelty, malice and unmatched arrogance as he proudly and loudly called me a worthless failure who would be absolutely nothing without his financial support. The audio perfectly captured his cruel, mocking laughter as he told me I was a pathetic, miserable freelancer who constantly dragged him down and that he was destined for massive corporate greatness while I was destined to rot in the gutter. The recorded version of Elliot bragged shamelessly to my face about how incredibly easy it was to simply discard our marriage and how Vanessa was a spectacular upgrade in every possible physical and professional way. The stark, jarring, incredible contrast between the booming, aggressive, arrogant voice playing from the small speaker of the phone and the whimpering, crawling, pathetic man currently kneeling on the floor was absolute pure poetry. Elliot stared at the phone as if it were a highly venomous snake coiled and ready to strike him dead. He stopped crying, completely paralyzed by the undeniable physical auditory proof of his own vile, toxic nature. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out as he listened to himself completely destroy the very woman he was now begging for mercy. The recording ended with a sharp, definitive click, leaving an oppressive, suffocating, terrifying silence in its massive wake. I picked up the phone with slow, deliberate grace and casually slipped it back into my suit pocket before looking back down at him. I told him quietly that his sudden, overwhelming, desperate love for me was incredibly touching, but that I vastly preferred the raw, brutal honesty of the man I just heard on the recording. Elliot swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as his panicked mind tried to find some impossible way to explain away his own recorded cruel words. He opened his mouth to offer another pathetic, shifting excuse, but I raised one single manicured finger and silenced him instantly. I leaned back deeply into my leather chair and allowed a slow, cold, calculating smile to curve my lips. It was a smile that contained absolutely zero warmth and zero mercy. I looked down at the pathetic creature ruining my floor and spoke in a tone of calm, absolute terrifying authority. I told him that I had considered his pitch and everything he just said, and that I had made a final executive decision regarding his firm's desperate financial request. I announced clearly and slowly that Vanguard Apex would indeed be moving forward with the proposed deal, and that I was personally injecting the full $50 million into his failing property tech company. For one fleeting, highly pathetic fraction of a second, a bright spark of desperate delusional hope ignited in Elliot's bloodshot eyes. His fragile ego was so massive that he actually briefly thought his pathetic groveling had worked. He let out a loud, breathless gasp of profound relief, fully believing that I was genuinely going to save his dead career and fully fund his ridiculous corporate dreams, just as he had arrogantly demanded in the lobby. He began to stammer out rapid words of immense gratitude, thanking me profusely and violently swearing that I would not regret the massive investment and that he would make me proud. I let him deeply enjoy that warm, comforting false illusion for exactly 5 agonizing seconds before I reached across the wide desk and picked up a sleek black legal folder. I tossed it casually onto the polished wood, letting it slide directly to the edge of the table, stopping right in front of his sweating face. I told him smoothly that there was just one small, minor little detail he had unfortunately overlooked during his desperate, eager scramble for our venture capital. I instructed him to open the black folder and look very closely at the final binding contract he had so blindly and happily signed with one of Vanguard's completely anonymous subsidiary holding companies just last week. Elliot reached up with trembling, wet hands and flipped open the heavy black cover. His wide, bloodshot eyes frantically scanned the dense legal text, desperately trying to comprehend the complex financial jargon swimming on the page. I did not make him wait to figure out his own doom. I calmly and mechanically recited the exact specific terms of his absolute financial destruction. I informed him that under the highly specific, non-negotiable provisions of Clause 4B of the binding bridge loan agreement, all C-suite executives of his firm were legally mandated to put up their complete personal assets as direct collateral to secure the initial funding release. I watched his face violently transform from a pale gray to a sickly, translucent, ghostly white as the lethal reality of the legal contract finally penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. I leaned forward, resting my forearms gracefully on the table, and lowered my voice to a sharp, precise whisper that cut straight through his empty soul. I told him with a bright, warm smile that his reckless, eager signature on that binding document meant that the $2 million suburban house, the exact same beautiful house he had so proudly and cruelly stolen from me and handed over to his cheap mistress, was now fully legally bound and tethered to the Vanguard Apex real estate portfolio. I watched the last tiny flickering light of hope completely die in his wide, terrified eyes as I explained the final mechanism of the trap. I informed him that because his firm was fundamentally insolvent and bleeding cash, the collateral clause had already been automatically triggered the moment the ink dried. I looked directly into the shattered remnants of his mind and told him that as of this exact morning, the house, the cars, the bank accounts, and every single asset he foolishly thought he owned now belonged entirely to me, leaving him a homeless, penniless ghost kneeling on the floor of a kingdom he could never ever touch. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the pathetic sound of Elliot's ragged, gasping breaths as he kneeled on the imported marble floor. His wide, terrified eyes stared up at me, completely shattered by the realization that he had just signed away his entire existence. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms against the cool, polished surface of the custom mahogany table, and looked down at him with the detached, clinical precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. There was no need to raise my voice. The acoustic perfection of the massive room carried my quiet words directly into his panicking brain. I told him that we needed to review the exact mathematical reality of his new life, because a man of his supposed corporate genius should always understand his own balance sheet. I opened a black leather ledger that Julian had silently placed next to my hand and began to read the numbers out loud. I explained that the $2 million balloon mortgage he had so arrogantly dumped on my shoulders yesterday was now entirely his legal responsibility. But because he had blindly triggered the collateral seizure clause in the Vanguard Apex bridge loan, that massive debt was immediately due in full. I watched his face drain of whatever pale color it had left, turning a sickly, translucent white as the sheer volume of the money he owed crashed over him. I did not stop there. I turned the page of the thick ledger and calmly detailed the specific corporate debt penalty he had personally guaranteed when he rushed to sign the subsidiary contract last week. I informed him that because his specific division had been operating at a massive loss for 3 consecutive years, a fact we had just publicly established and documented, he was now legally liable for a default penalty of an additional $4.5 million. I watched his fragile mind desperately try to calculate a way out of the bottomless financial abyss I had just pushed him into. His chest he heaved violently under his sweat-drenched rented suit as he realized he had absolutely no income to leverage against the crushing debt. I reminded him in a smooth, even tone that his career at the property tech firm was officially terminated as of this exact morning, rendering his equity entirely worthless and his executive stock options permanently void. He was completely ruined. He did not just have $0 in his bank account, he was buried under millions of dollars of federal and corporate debt that he could never possibly repay in 100 lifetimes. He opened his mouth trying to form words, trying to beg for a fraction of mercy, but his vocal cords simply refused to work. He let out a hollow, pathetic wheezing sound, his clammy hands slipping off the edge of the mahogany table as his body went completely limp with severe shock. I closed the black ledger with a soft, definitive thud that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I sat back in my high-backed executive chair and looked at the broken, weeping shell of the man who had spent 5 years trying to make me feel small. He was sobbing openly now, hot tears streaming down his pale face and dripping onto the expensive stone floor, completely stripped of the toxic masculine ego he had worn like a crown for so long. He looked up at me with raw, desperate, pleading eyes, silently begging me to reverse time, to undo the catastrophic trap he had willingly walked into. I offered him a slow, terrifyingly polite smile and delivered the final blow. "You told me failures don't belong in your house, Elliot. You were right. My asset recovery team is at the property right now, changing the locks and throwing your cheap suits onto the lawn." The absolute finality of my words struck him with the devastating force of a physical impact. The beautiful suburban house, the imported luxury cars, the expensive watches, The joint bank accounts, the entire fake luxurious lifestyle he had built on a foundation of lies and arrogance, was being actively dismantled and legally erased at this exact moment. He realized with crushing clarity that he had absolutely nowhere to go. He could not go back to his corner office. He could not go back to his comfortable home. He could not even afford to buy a cheap cup of coffee on the street. He was a ghost trapped in the wreckage of his own monumental greed. He collapsed fully onto his stomach, his forehead pressing against the cold marble as he broke down into loud, ugly, uncontrollable sobbing. The sound of his total humiliation filled the vast executive suite, a pathetic symphony of pure corporate destruction. I watched him writhe on the floor for a few long seconds, letting him fully experience the absolute suffocating terror of true powerlessness. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I only felt the satisfying clean warmth of absolute justice. I casually raised my right hand and snapped my manicured fingers. The sharp, crisp sound cut through his pathetic weeping instantly. Julian, who had been standing silently in the corner like a patient predator, immediately gave a curt, definitive nod to the security team. The two massive, burly guards who had remained stationed by the heavy frosted glass doors moved forward with terrifying speed and precision. They reached Elliot in seconds, bending down and grabbing him roughly by his upper arms. They did not ask him to stand. They simply hauled him off the floor, completely lifting his dead weight into the air. Elliot thrashed weakly, his expensive leather shoes dragging uselessly across the marble, but he was completely powerless against their immense physical strength. He cried out my name, his voice cracking and pitching upward in a frantic, desperate wail, begging me to look at him, begging me to save him from the nightmare he had created. I did not grant him the courtesy of a second glance. I turned my chair slightly toward the panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling Atlanta skyline, stretching for miles in every direction. The bright morning sunlight poured through the glass, warming my face as I listened to the guards physically drag my sobbing, ruined ex-husband backward across the massive room. His frantic pleas grew louder and more hysterical as they hauled him toward the exit, his fingers scrabbling uselessly at the air, as if trying to hold on to a life that no longer existed. The heavy frosted glass doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, and the guards dragged him out into the busy executive corridor where his former colleagues could witness his absolute downfall. His loud, uncontrollable sobbing echoed briefly in the hallway before Julian stepped forward and pressed the control panel. The thick doors slid shut firmly and securely, instantly cutting off the pathetic sounds of his misery and plunging the boardroom back into a deep, pristine silence. I sat perfectly still in my executive chair, the cool air of the room settling peacefully around me. The slate was completely wiped clean. The arrogant men and women who had tried to build their petty empires on my back had been systematically, completely, and flawlessly eradicated from my reality. I smoothed the crisp fabric of my bespoke midnight blue power suit and looked at Julian, who was calmly tapping an update into his sleek black iPad, finalizing the last details of the asset transfer. The total foreclosure was finally complete and the entire empire was safely and undisputedly mine. I watched the high-definition security feed on the digital tablet. Julian handed me as the two remaining architects of my misery were violently escorted through the grand marble lobby of the Vanguard building. The armed building security did not offer them the courtesy of a slow, dignified exit. They marched Elliot and Spencer past the geometric water features in the main atrium and the staring crowds of high-level executives pushing them roughly toward the main lobby exits. Spencer was stumbling over his own feet, his chest heaving with panic, his empty hands clutching at the air as a forgotten relic of his dead career. Elliot looked like a hollow shell of a man, his face pale and slack as the guards shoved him through the exit and out onto the harsh concrete of the downtown plaza. The heavy glass doors locked behind them with a definitive mechanical seal, physically and permanently barring them from the financial empire they had foolishly tried to steal from me. The sky above the city had darkened considerably, mirroring the absolute ruin of their personal lives. A sudden, sharp crack of thunder rolled across the downtown skyline, and the heavens opened up, dumping a freezing torrential downpour directly onto their heads. The cold, heavy rain instantly soaked through their ruined business attire, plastering the thin fabric to their shivering bodies. Elliot stumbled away from the building entrance, his waterlogged dress shoes slipping on the wet pavement as he frantically dug into his pockets. His hands were shaking so violently that he dropped his sleek leather wallet, scattering his platinum credit cards across the flooded sidewalk. He dropped to his knees in the freezing puddles, desperately gathering the plastic squares that used to define his entire identity and his arrogant self-worth. He pulled out his phone, the screen completely streaked with rain, and frantically dialed the private concierge number for his primary black card, hoping to secure a luxury hotel room to escape the storm and figure out a desperate survival plan. I watched the security feed zoom in, slightly capturing the exact moment the automated voice on the other end of the line informed him that his accounts had been universally frozen and seized pending federal investigation and aggressive corporate asset recovery. His mouth fell open in a silent scream of pure terror as he tried card after card, dialing number after number, only to hear the exact same devastating automated rejection. He was a confident millionaire just an hour ago, and now he could not even afford a cheap taxi ride out of the rain. Spencer stood a few feet away, entirely oblivious to Elliot's massive financial panic. He was hugging himself against the freezing downpour, shivering uncontrollably, when his own cell phone began to vibrate violently in his soaked jacket pocket. He pulled it out, his eyes widening in absolute terror when he saw the caller ID flashing on the wet screen. It was Tasha, his incredibly demanding high-maintenance wife, who measured a man's worth entirely by his country club status, his luxury vehicles, and his quarterly corporate bonuses. Spencer hesitated, his thumb trembling over the screen, knowing deep in his bones that the conversation he was about to have would be the final lethal nail in his coffin. He swiped to answer, bringing the phone to his ear with a pathetic whimpering hello that was instantly drowned out by the shrill, furious screaming coming from the other end of the line. Tasha's voice was so loud and so filled with pure, unadulterated rage that the hidden security microphones near the building entrance picked up the audio perfectly. She did not ask if he was okay. She did not ask how the crucial venture capital pitch had gone. She immediately launched into a vicious verbal assault, screaming that she had just received a deeply humiliating phone call from the president of their exclusive private golf club, informing her that their elite membership had been permanently revoked due to a sudden catastrophic bankruptcy flag on their accounts. Spencer tried to speak, to formulate some kind of pathetic excuse to beg her to listen to his side of the story, but she cut him off with a relentless string of vicious insults. She screamed that her brother, who worked as a senior analyst at a competing financial firm, had just called to gleefully inform her that Spencer had been publicly fired without severance, and that his entire highly subsidized department had been instantly dissolved. She told him he was a pathetic, worthless loser who had completely humiliated her in front of her entire wealthy social circle. Spencer begged her to calm down, stammering through his violently chattering teeth that they could figure it out together, that he would leverage his network to find another executive job, that they could quickly bounce back from this minor setback. Tasha let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed terribly through the falling rain. She told him there was absolutely no bouncing back from this level of professional radioactive waste. She coldly and methodically informed him that she had already contacted her aggressive divorce attorney and that she was officially filing the papers before the end of the day. She told him that she was taking full primary custody of their children, taking the suburban house, the imported luxury cars, and whatever microscopic shreds of dignity he had left to his name. She ordered him to never step foot on her property again and violently hung up the phone, leaving Spencer standing in the freezing rain, listening to the dead dial tone of his shattered life. The absolute catastrophic destruction of his marriage and his entire social existence finally snapped the last fragile thread holding Spencer's mind together. He slowly lowered the phone, his face contorting into a mask of pure feral rage. He turned his head and locked his bloodshot eyes onto Elliot, who was still kneeling in the flooded gutter crying over his useless blocked credit cards. Spencer let out a raw, guttural scream that tore through the sound of the heavy falling rain and lunged directly at the man who had dragged him into this spectacular corporate slaughterhouse. He tackled Elliot, catching him completely off guard and slamming him backward into a deep puddle of filthy street water. He wrapped his hands tightly around Elliot's collar, pulling him up and slamming him back down against the wet concrete, screaming that this was all his fault, that his pathetic obsession with his cheap mistress and his blinding, arrogant greed had systematically destroyed both of their lives. Elliot thrashed blindly in the freezing water, throwing a wild, uncoordinated punch that connected solidly with Spencer's jaw. The two men, the former untouchable arrogant titans of the property tech world, were now rolling around in the wet, garbage-filled street, throwing clumsy, pathetic punches at each other like common desperate street thugs. They slipped and scrambled in the mud, tearing their expensive soaked suits and bleeding onto the cold pavement, entirely stripped of their wealth, their corporate titles, and their toxic massive egos. I tapped the glass screen of the tablet, turning off the security feed and plunging the device into a sleek, dark silence. I did not need to watch them beat each other into a bloody, pathetic pulp in the gutter to know that the job was flawlessly completed. I handed the tablet back to Julian, who took it with a respectful, silent nod and retreated to the quiet periphery of the room. I stood up from the long, polished conference table and walked slowly toward the towering glass walls looking out over the rain-swept city. The violent thunderstorm raged fiercely against the thick, reinforced glass, but inside the massive executive boardroom, the air was perfectly calm, completely silent, and beautifully pristine. I walked over to a custom crystal decanter resting on a polished silver cart and poured myself a tall, elegant glass of extremely rare vintage champagne, watching the tiny golden bubbles rise rapidly to the surface. Julian approached quietly from behind, holding a thick stack of freshly printed, finalized company takeover documents, resting perfectly on a leather tray. The toxic trash had successfully taken itself out exactly as I had planned from the very beginning. I took a slow, deep sip of the cold, crisp champagne, letting the sweet, rich taste of absolute total victory wash over my tongue. I looked down at the rain-slicked streets 50 stories below, feeling the incredible, untouchable weight of my new empire surrounding me, knowing with absolute certainty that I would never have to be small, quiet, or submissive ever again. The slaughter was over, the revenge was absolute, and the throne was finally undisputedly mine. 6 months is an incredibly long time in the corporate world, but it is an absolute brutal eternity when you are falling straight down to the very bottom of the food chain. The heavy, suffocating smell of cheap frying oil and burned salt hung thickly in the humid afternoon air. Elliot stood at the drive-through window of a dilapidated fast food franchise wearing a brightly colored polyester uniform shirt that was 2 sizes too small for his frame. A cheap, cracked plastic name tag was pinned crookedly to his chest, a pathetic replacement for the expensive tailored suits he used to proudly wear. He wiped a heavy bead of greasy sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand as a beat-up sedan pulled up to his window. The teenagers inside the car laughed loudly, throwing crumpled dollar bills at him before snatching their greasy paper bags and speeding away into the traffic. Elliot did not yell or try to assert his former aggressive corporate dominance. He simply kept his head down, staring blankly at the sticky, grease-covered floor. The tiny speaker in his ear crackled with the angry, sharp voice of his teenage manager, demanding that he move faster and stop daydreaming. Every single cent of his miserable minimum wage paycheck was being aggressively garnished by a relentless army of federal tax collectors and ruthless corporate lawyers. The massive IRS penalties from the fraudulent venture capital scheme had buried him so deep in an inescapable financial abyss that he would be handing out cheap hamburgers and listening to screaming customers until the day he finally died. A few miles away in a bleak county holding facility, Vanessa was experiencing her own personal version of absolute hell. She sat on a thin, lumpy mattress staring vacantly at a peeling gray cinder-block wall. The luxurious silk designer dresses, the expensive imported leather handbags, and the shiny platform shoes she had practically killed for were completely gone. She was wearing a faded, scratchy, oversized orange jumpsuit that marked her as a high-risk federal inmate. She was currently awaiting trial for her direct involvement in the corporate fraud and embezzlement scheme, and the aggressive federal prosecutors had made it abundantly clear that they were pursuing the maximum possible sentence. There were no wealthy, arrogant men left for her to manipulate, and there were no lavish tropical vacations to rescue her from the terrifying cold reality of a 10-year federal prison sentence. The heavy metal doors clanged shut, echoing loudly down the cold concrete hallway, completely sealing her inside a miserable cage of her own making. She had tried to use her physical charm on the prison guards and the female inmates, but her fake tears and her manipulative whining only earned her harsh laughter and complete terrifying isolation. Spencer was faring no better in his new pathetic reality. He was sitting alone on the edge of a severely stained mattress in a tiny rundown studio apartment that smelled faintly of mildew, rotting wood, and stale despair. The single flickering light bulb overhead cast long, depressing shadows across the cramped, filthy room. His aggressive, demanding ex-wife, Tasha, had completely gutted him in the brutal divorce proceedings, taking full custody of the children and completely wiping out whatever microscopic financial assets he had managed to hide from the federal auditors. He was entirely broke, permanently stripped of his elite country club memberships, his luxury imported cars, and his hollow, highly inflated executive title. He spent his long, empty days staring blankly at the peeling yellow wallpaper, eating cheap, instant ramen noodles, and wondering how his massive corporate empire had vanished in the blink of an eye. A stack of aggressive past due notices and final eviction warnings was piled high on the small, scratched kitchen counter. His phone never rang anymore. None of his former wealthy friends or loyal corporate allies wanted anything to do with a disgraced, bankrupt executive who was completely radioactive in the financial sector. The deep, agonizing silence of his empty, moldy apartment was the only companion he had left in the world. The stark, miserable reality of their ruined lives was completely irrelevant to me. Thousands of miles away from the freezing rain and the crushing corporate debts, the warm, brilliant sun of the Mediterranean Sea was sparkling across the deep azure water. I stood on the expansive, polished teak deck of my brand-new multi-million-dollar custom-built luxury yacht, letting the gentle, salty breeze catch my hair. The air was incredibly warm and fragrant, a million miles away from the sterile, suffocating boardrooms of Atlanta. I was wearing a flowing white silk dress that caught the ocean breeze perfectly, and my bare feet rested comfortably against the warm, sun-baked wood of the deck. The massive vessel cut smoothly through the gentle rolling waves, a floating fortress of absolute power and pristine, untouchable luxury. The rocky, beautiful coastline of the Amalfi Coast stretched out in the distance, a stunning backdrop to my absolute total victory. Julian stood quietly beside me, dressed impeccably in a lightweight tailored linen suit, holding a sleek black leather portfolio. He calmly presented the latest quarterly financial reports, his voice a steady, reassuring presence over the rhythmic sound of the crashing ocean waves. He detailed the highly successful absorption of the rival property tech firms and the massive exponential growth of the Vanguard Apex portfolio. The strategic hostile takeovers we had flawlessly executed over the past 6 months had yielded an unprecedented windfall of pure profit. Our international expansion was moving perfectly ahead of schedule, and the market share we now commanded was absolutely staggering. I reached over to the small silver table beside me and picked up a delicate crystal flute filled with the most expensive rare vintage champagne in the world. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the crisp, cold, sweet liquid wash over my tongue. I looked out at the endless, beautiful horizon, feeling absolutely radiant, incredibly powerful, and completely unbothered by the pathetic ghosts of my past. The heavy, exhausting weight of my former miserable marriage was entirely gone, replaced by the intoxicating, limitless freedom of absolute financial dominance and total, undeniable peace. I stepped closer to the gleaming silver railing of the yacht, resting my hands gracefully against the cool metal and looking directly out into the vast, open expanse of the world. I knew there were millions of women out there currently sitting in their own versions of the suffocating, miserable prison I had just escaped. They spend years shrinking their own brilliant minds and silencing their own powerful voices just to keep the fragile peace in a toxic home. They told me I was overreacting. They told me to shrink myself so a weak man could feel tall. But I didn't overreact. I simply leveled the playing field. Never let a mediocre family convince you that your crown is too heavy. Keep your receipts, protect your peace, and when the time comes, buy the whole damn building. It is entirely possible to walk away from the toxic, manipulative partners who constantly try to drag you down to their miserable level. It takes time, and it takes careful, ruthless strategy. But the sweet taste of total, absolute freedom is worth every single agonizing second of the hard battle. You do not have to accept the crumbs of affection from people who do not value your brilliant mind or respect your intense hard work. If you have ever had to quietly pack your bags and completely walk away from a highly toxic relationship or a deeply manipulative partner, I want to hear your story. Please share your own personal experiences of reclaiming your power and finding your true worth in the comment section below. Hit that subscribe button to join a powerful, growing community of people who refuse to be silenced, and stick around for more stories about taking back control, completely rewriting the rules of the game, and building your own massive, untouchable empire.